I believe it was during the summer of 2008 when this happened, even though the years seem to mix together now like fog coming down from the hills. My name is Harlan, and I have lived my entire life in these West Virginia hills. I live near Canaan Valley, where the wind is very cold and sharp as it blows through the pine trees. The nearest big store is a long 1-hour drive away over very curvy roads. At that time, I was about 50 years old. I worked at the front gate of Blackwater Falls State Park. My job was to collect money from the tourists who came to look at the waterfall and walk on the trails. It was not fancy work. I just sat in a small booth, gave people maps, and told them to be careful of black bears. The pay was enough for me to buy wood for my heater in the winter and put gas in my old Chevy truck. To be honest, I liked the job because it was very quiet and far away from other people. There was no cell phone service out there back then. You could scream all day long, and the only things that would hear you were the birds. That night, I was working the late shift. I stayed until midnight or until the last camper arrived. Usually, the park closes when it gets dark, but sometimes people show up late because they are lost or stubborn. I remember that the air felt very thick and heavy with moisture before the rain started. It was the kind of weather that makes your shirt stick to your skin. I had a thermos of strong black coffee that I made on my kitchen stove that morning. My stove is a very old, heavy metal machine that belonged to my grandfather. It always leaves a faint, oily smell on everything. It smells like old bacon fat mixed with the black dust from the chimney. I have tried to clean it with a metal brush, but the smell never goes away. The smell gets into the pots, the pans, and even the wooden spoons on the wall. Every time I get the stove hot, the door makes a weird squeaking sound, like it is complaining about being used. Old grease builds up in the corners and stays sticky no matter how much I try to clean it. As I drank my coffee in the booth that night, I could still taste that old grease on the edge of my thermos. It reminded me of my home while I sat there in the dark. It is strange how small things like that can make you feel safe when the world starts to feel scary. The booth was just a small box with a window that slid open. There was a buzzing light over my head that sounded like a trapped bug. I had maps on a shelf, a radio that only played static, and a chair that was not very steady. I had been there since noon. During the day, I watched families come into the park with their kids and their coolers. By the time evening came, everyone was gone. It was just me and the trees. There were no neighbors for 10 miles. That is the good part and the bad part about living in these valleys. You feel very small, like the green forest is swallowing you. The silence feels very heavy, like a wet blanket pressing on you. Then, the rain began to fall. It was not a light rain. It was a very heavy storm that hit like a hammer. The rain fell in sheets and turned the gravel parking lot into a mess of mud. The red dirt around here gets very slippery and sticks to your boots like it wants to pull you down. I stayed inside the booth and opened the window just a little bit to let out the smoke from my cigarette. I smoked Camels back then, which were very strong. The rain made a steady sound on the roof. I was eating some old candy I found in my truck. They were fruit-flavored mints that were half melted and sticky. I chewed them slowly to pass the time and keep my mind busy. That is when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind or a bird, but it was not. It was a cry. It sounded exactly like a baby crying. It was a sharp sound that cut through the noise of the rain. I sat up straight and my chair made a loud noise. The sound was coming from outside, near the road where a large concrete pipe carries water under the pavement. That pipe is very old and big enough for a person to crawl through. I listened very carefully. The crying sounded desperate, like a small child left alone in the storm. But that made no sense. No cars or hikers had come through the gate for many hours. The park was locked up. The nearest house was miles away. There was no way a baby could be out there. I threw my cigarette into a puddle and watched the fire go out. The crying happened again, and it was louder this time. It made me feel very worried. I should have stayed inside. I should have used the radio to call for help, but the radio did not work well in the rain, and I thought they would just laugh at me for reporting a ghost baby. So I took my big, heavy flashlight and stepped out into the storm. The rain felt like needles on my skin. My shirt was soaked in seconds, and I felt very cold. My boots made splashing sounds in the mud as I walked toward the pipe. The park light was yellow, but it did not help much against the dark shadows under the trees. The crying sounded very clear now because it was bouncing off the concrete walls of the pipe. It was a high-pitched scream that would make anyone feel sad. I pointed my light around, but I saw nothing. There was only the dark opening of the pipe with a little bit of water flowing out. The sound was definitely coming from inside the pipe. I knelt down in the wet dirt. I could smell the wet mud and the sharp scent of the rain. I shined my light deep into the pipe. It was empty. There were only some old drawings on the walls and the sound of water. But the crying was right there in my face. I could feel the air moving from the sound. It was only inches away. Then the sound changed. The crying became wet and bubbly, like a baby was choking on something. It was a gross, ragged sound that did not sound like it came from a human throat. I was too scared to move. "Hello," I called out. My voice sounded very small in the storm. The sound changed again. It repeated my word, "hello," but it sounded stretched out and wrong. I felt very frightened. It felt like the valley was playing a trick on me or using the pipe to make voices. I stepped back while the rain hit my back. The sound went back to a baby's cry, but then it said a name. It said my name. "Harlan," it cried in a sad way. I did not understand how it knew my name. I shined my light into the pipe again, and my hand was shaking. I still saw nothing but water. The water was moving as if something was stirring it from the other side. Then the voice changed into my mother's voice. My mother had died 5 years before from cancer. But I heard her calling me. She said, "Holland, come here, boy." The voice sounded flat and slow, like an old tape player with dying batteries. The pitch was wrong, and it sounded like it was dragging. My chest felt very tight. I had not heard her voice in many years. I moved backward quickly and fell into the mud. My flashlight rolled away, and the light spun around the trees. The voice kept going. It switched between the baby and my mother, mixing the sounds together. I grabbed my light and ran to my truck. I locked the doors and started the engine. I did not drive away yet. I just sat there with the heater on, watching the pipe through the windshield wipers. The rain stopped by morning. The crying had stopped earlier, fading away into nothing. I called my boss and said I was sick. I drove home while my body was still shaking. I told myself it was just the wind or an animal. But I knew the truth. These hills hold on to memories, or maybe there is something much worse that copies voices to trick people. I quit that job shortly after that night. Now, I only work during the day fixing fences. But at night, I still hear things. I hear sounds in the wind that remind me of that night. I think about that pipe a lot. It is still there under the road, waiting for another storm. The park workers probably think the sounds are just wild animals. But I know that those drainage pipes go deep into the hills. They connect to old, broken coal mines. Those are places where there is no light and sounds travel in strange ways. Maybe something lives down there and learns how to speak by listening to the water. Or maybe the land itself is just lonely and mean. I drove past the park once years later, but I did not stop. The booth looked the same. I wonder if the person working there now has heard the sound. People around here do not talk about these things. We just put more wood in our stoves and hope the smell of the house covers up whatever is wrong outside. That night changed how I feel about the quiet. It used to be peaceful, but now it feels like it is waiting for me. Every noise in the leaves makes me wonder if it is starting again. I keep a Bible near my bed now, even though I do not go to church often. I read it when I cannot sleep, but words cannot erase my memories. I still remember the drive home that morning. My house is at the end of a dirt road. I sat in my truck for a while and then went inside to make coffee. The smell of the old stove made me feel a little better, but my mother's voice stayed in my head. When I was a kid, she called my name in a sweet way, but the voice in the pipe was not like that. It was a copy that was put together incorrectly. Whatever made that sound did not understand love. It only knew the shape of the noise. I tried to tell my brother about it once. He laughed and said I was just tired. But I could see in his eyes that he did not want to hear more. We do not talk about it anymore. Winter is the hardest time. The snow makes everything very silent. I hear cries in the wind during the winter. I lock my doors and keep the fire going. If you are ever near Blackwater during a storm, listen to the pipes. It might be nothing, or it might be something calling your name in a very wrong way. I stay away from there now. These hills remember, and they do not forget. The job left me with bad memories that make me wake up sweating and looking for a light. I dream about being inside that pipe with the voices closing in on me. People say time makes things better, but they are wrong. It just buries the fear deeper, like roots in the dirt, waiting for the rain to bring it back up. I fixed my house with new locks and lights, but lights do not reach everywhere. Shadows still hide in the corners. I am older now and I do not sleep much. I sit on my porch and watch the trees. I am waiting. That crying sound I heard, it was not a hungry baby. It was something hunting. It wanted to draw me close to see what it was. I do not go hiking anymore. I stay in town, but sometimes the valleys call to me in the quiet. I just turn up my radio to drown out the sound. I wonder what I would have found if I had looked deeper into that pipe with my light. But some things are better if they stay in the dark. I remember the water rising fast that night. I remember kneeling in the mud and the cold biting my skin. Then I heard her voice. Harlan. It was so flat and raw. I ran to my truck to be safe. But I wonder if I am ever truly safe. The feeling that something is wrong has never left me. It is like mud on my boots that I can never fully clean off. Whenever it rains, the memory comes back. These hills have secrets. It is best to leave them alone. That is my story. I am tired now because remembering these things wears me down. Story 2. I think it was back in the autumn of 1992 when everything went wrong, although these days the seasons all blend together in my mind like mud after a heavy rain. My name is Earl, and I have lived in these West Virginia hills for all of my 60-odd years. When I was younger, I worked mostly as a logger, but now I just spend my time repairing old tractors for the people who live down in the valley. Back then, my cousin Jimmy and I were very close friends. He was only a few years younger than me. We decided to go out and look for deer near the edge of the Monongahela National Forest. It was not hunting season yet, so we were just exploring the land and looking for marks on the trees where the male deer might have rubbed their antlers. The air was cold and fresh. The leaves were changing colors but had not fallen yet, and a light rain was falling from the sky. We left my house at sunrise, and our truck made a rattling noise as we drove over the gravel road that goes up from the town of Elkins. We did not have cell phones back then, and even if we did, there is no phone signal in that part of the woods. The nearest neighbor lived at least 2 miles away through the thick bushes. When you are out in those woods, you are completely alone with whatever secrets the trees decide to keep. Jimmy drove his old Ford truck, which blew blue smoke out of the tailpipe. The radio was playing a country station that was full of static and eventually faded away completely once we reached the trees. We parked at a small area by the side of the road that nobody ever uses. It was covered in thorny bushes that caught on our jeans. I grabbed my backpack, which had my water bottle, a knife, and some sandwiches wrapped in paper, and we started walking. The trail was not a real path. It was just a trail made by animals that we had followed since we were children. It wound through oak and hickory trees that grew very close together. Their branches crossed over our heads like a broken roof. The silence out there is strange. It does not feel peaceful. Instead, it feels like the silence is waiting to swallow any noise you might make. We walked quietly, our boots sinking into the wet ground. We talked softly about unimportant things like Jimmy's job at the mill and my bad knee from a logging accident I had years ago. After we had walked about a mile, the rain became steady. It was not a heavy rain, but it soaked through our shirts and made the leaves on the ground very slippery. My boots were old Red Wings that I had owned since 1985, and they began to squeak with every single step. It was an annoying sound of wet leather rubbing on rubber that really bothers you after a while. I used to put oil on them regularly, but the squeak always came back as if the boots had their own personality. The bottoms of the boots were worn smooth in some places and were covered in red clay that is impossible to wash off. The laces were also falling apart at the ends because I had tied them in knots so many times. Every time I stepped down, the boots would make a squeak creak sound, then there would be a pause, and then they would squeak again on the next step. It sounded like a rusty door hinge. Sometimes I would stop and move my toes to try and make the noise stop, but it would start again immediately. The sound echoed off the trees in a rhythm that matched our breathing. At first, Jimmy laughed and said it sounded like I was walking with a musical instrument. But after a while, even he became quiet. That squeak was the only sound we could hear besides the rain hitting the leaves. I remember thinking that the annoying noise made the woods feel normal and safe, even as the trail got narrower and the light got darker under the trees. But now that I look back, maybe that squeak was a warning. It felt like the woods were trying to speak through the things we had brought with us. We kept going until we were about 3 miles deep into the forest, which was further than we usually went. The path went down into a valley where the ground was flat and a small creek was nearby. It was not a big creek, just a small amount of water moving over mossy rocks, but it made a constant sound. There were no houses or roads out there. You were totally cut off from the world, with steep hills rising on both sides like giant walls. Jimmy was walking in front of me and pointing at a spot where a deer had rubbed a small tree when he suddenly stopped. He whispered, "What is that?" I walked up to him, and there it was, sitting right in the middle of the trail, a sewing machine. It was not a cheap plastic machine from a modern store. It was the old kind made of heavy iron, with a foot pedal at the bottom and a large wheel on the side. It looked like something from my grandmother's house. It was painted shiny black with gold decorations, and there was still a needle with thread in it, as if someone had just been using it yesterday. We stood there as rain dripped off our hats. There was no rust on the machine at all. The woods around us were empty, and there were no footprints or marks in the mud to show how it got there. The machine was very heavy. It did not seem like someone could have carried it out there just to play a joke. I cannot explain it, but seeing that perfect machine sitting in the mud felt very wrong. It felt as if the valley had created it, or as if it had walked there by itself. Jimmy walked around it slowly, and his boots made splashing sounds in the mud. He tried to laugh, but his voice sounded very nervous when he said, "That is really something." The air felt very heavy and thick, like the feeling you get right before a loud thunderclap. I knelt down closer and used my small flashlight. The batteries were almost dead, so the light was yellow and weak. The metal of the machine was shiny, and water sat on it in drops as if it had been freshly oiled. The thread was white and was looped neatly through the needle. I did not recognize the brand name, but it looked very old, perhaps from the 1920s. The silence around us became even deeper, and the rain seemed to get quieter. My boots made a squeaking sound as I moved. but even that noise sounded like it was coming from far away. Then, the handle on the machine began to turn. It moved very slowly at first. The wheel moved just a little bit, like a breeze was blowing it, but there was no wind moving the leaves. We stood perfectly still. The wheel turned again, moving more smoothly and getting faster. It made a click-click sound as the needle moved up and down, as if it were sewing the air. But the sound was not the normal sound of metal touching metal. It sounded like whispers moving through gravel. The voices were low and rough. You could not understand the words, but you could feel them in your bones. It sounded like secrets or names that had been forgotten for a long time. Jimmy tried to reach out his hand to touch it, but I grabbed his arm and told him to stop. His skin felt very cold and wet. The machine started moving even faster. The clicking sound became very quick, and the rhythm started to match the sound of our breathing. The air felt full of electricity, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Everything felt completely wrong. We began to back away slowly, keeping our eyes on the machine. The wheel was spinning very fast now, and the thread was whipping around. The sound changed into a rough noise that sounded like someone was laughing while choking on dirt. We turned and ran as fast as we could. Our boots hit the mud hard, and the squeaking sound was lost in the noise of us crashing through the bushes. Tree branches hit our faces, and the rain made it hard to see. We did not stop running until we reached the gravel road and saw the truck. We stood there breathing hard with our hands on our knees. Jimmy looked very pale and asked, "What was that?" I told him I did not know and that I never wanted to know. We drove home in total silence and kept the radio turned off. We went to my trailer first, which is at the end of the valley. There was no phone to call anyone, so it was just the two of us with that memory. Inside, I started a fire in my wood stove. I have had that old iron stove forever. The hinges on the door always squeak in a specific pattern, a long sound, a short sound, and then a pause, every time I open it to put in more wood. The inside of my home always smells like wood smoke and pine trees, but under that smell, there is a faint scent of old burnt food. I cook eggs in a pan every morning, and the black grease builds up in the metal. No matter how much I scrub it with salt, that grease stays there. It looks shiny in the firelight and smells like old bacon mixed with the scent of damp logs. As the stove gets hot, the metal makes popping sounds, and the chimney pipe rattles when the wind blows. That night, I sat there and watched the fire. The hinges squeaked as I added more wood, and the smell of grease was very strong. Taking care of the fire is boring work. You have to move the coals and adjust the air vents, but it keeps the cold out and makes you feel grounded when things get strained. That rhythmic squeak-creak pause helped me push the memory of those whispers away. But even now, when I hear my stove, I think of that clicking sound and wonder if the stove is listening to me. Jimmy slept on my couch that night. We did not say much. We just drank some warm beer from the fridge. He left the next morning at sunrise. After that day, we did not see each other as much. He went back to his job at the mill, and I stopped going into the woods. I have never gone back to that trail. People ask me why I stopped hunting deer, and I just tell them that my knee is too painful. But the truth is that I am afraid of that wrongness. It felt as if the valley had taken something made by humans and twisted it into something scary. Now, I spend my nights sitting by the stove and listening to the hinges. Whenever it rains on my tin roof, I remember that machine spinning all by itself. I wonder what it was trying to sew. Was it just sewing the air, or was it pulling at the threads of reality? I only take short drives to town to buy food. The roads are empty, and the trees always seem to be watching me. I wonder if the machine is still there, shiny and waiting. I dream about it sometimes. In my dreams, the wheel is turning and the whispers are calling my name. I wake up sweating and have to start a fire in the stove. The smell of the grease makes me feel better, but the silence outside is terrifying. The trees seemed to hold that silence very close. Jimmy called me once many years later. He asked if I ever went back there. I told him no. He said, "Good," and then we hung up. That was the end of it. These hills have places where things just do not fit correctly. There are old mines that have collapsed and creeks that seem to flow backward after a storm. Maybe that machine was from an old cabin that disappeared, or maybe it was something pretending to be a machine. I stay in my trailer now and keep my routine with the stove, but when the heavy rain comes, I can still hear a clicking sound. I lock my doors and wait for the sun to come up. Being isolated is a curse because there are no neighbors and no phone signal. It is just you and the things that are wrong. I think that is why the memory stays with me. There is no one to tell and no proof that it happened. It is just a memory that keeps me awake. I eventually bought new boots that do not squeak, but sometimes I actually miss that noise. It was a normal, human annoyance. Without it, the silence of the woods is just too loud. Out there in the forest, things are waiting. I am never going back.
Story Tree.
I believe it was back in the spring of 1987 when this happened. The dates are a bit blurry in my memory now, like old photographs that have been left in a damp place. My name is Clyde. I have lived in these Tennessee hills my whole life. I live up near the Smoky Mountains, where the hills fold over each other and the fog stays around like a bad habit. I was in my 40s back then. I was working as a part-time land surveyor for the Park Service. My job was to map out the soil for some people from a university who were studying how the ground wears away. It was not steady work, but it got me outside into the woods. It kept me away from the loud noises of the town. To be honest, I liked the quiet back then. There were no cell phones to ring all the time. Even if there were, they would not work out there anyway. My nearest neighbor lived 3 miles down a gravel road from my cabin. Once you are on the trails, it is just you and the trees. The silence is so thick that it feels like it is pressing against you. That day, I had a deadline for a project. I needed to get a few more soil samples from the North Rim overlook. The mist was coming in very heavy. It was the kind of mist that turns the world gray and makes all sounds very quiet. I thought I could still do the work, so I decided to go. I packed my tools, my small shovel, bags, and notebook. I headed out before the sun came up. My truck made loud rumbling noises as I drove over the bumpy road until I reached the start of the trail. The walk up the hill was nothing new to me. It was a steady climb through pine trees and bushes that caught my sleeves like they were trying to stop me. The rain started out light, but then it got stronger. It turned the path into slippery mud that pulled at my boots. I remember stopping halfway to catch my breath. I leaned against a tree and listened to the water dripping off the leaves. No birds were singing. No squirrels were making noise. It was just that heavy silence the woods get when the weather is bad. It made me feel very small and cut off from the rest of the world. I kept going because I thought the rim was only 1 more mile away. By the time I got to the top, the mist was a very thick fog. I could only see about 50 feet in front of me. The rain was steady and cold now. It felt like cold fingers running down my neck under my jacket. I found an old fallen log that was covered in moss and felt very soft. I sat down to take out my bottle of coffee. That coffee was the only thing that made me feel good on those trips. I had made it very strong on my wood stove at home before I left. That stove is very old. It is a heavy piece of black metal that sits in the corner of my kitchen. It feels like it has grown roots into the floor. I start a fire in it every morning, even in the summer. My cabin gets a very deep chill because of the nearby creek. The first thing you notice is the smell when you lift the lid. It smells like old grease that has been baked into the metal for many years. It is the smell of bacon and cornbread. It is a sharp, fatty smell that mixes with the wood smoke. It stays in the air as thick as the fog outside. I try to scrub the metal with a rough cleaning pad, but the grease just moves around. It leaves dark marks on my cloth. No amount of soap can make it completely clean. The hinges on the door make a loud noise when you open it. It is a low sound that lasts a long time and then ends with a snap. It sounds like the door does not want to let go. Every time I put in a piece of wood, it makes the same pattern of sounds. It goes whine snap, then a pause, then whine snap again. The sound bounces off the wooden walls of my cabin. The top of the stove has little holes from the heat. The grease collects in those holes and sizzles when the stove gets hot. It sends up small puffs of bitter smoke. That smoke hurts your eyes if you stand too close to it. I think I have cooked 1,000 meals on that stove. I have fried many eggs and made many biscuits, but that smell never goes away. It gets into your clothes and your hair. It reminds you of all the mornings you have spent alone with just the fire and the smell of the grease for company. I poured that coffee into my cup that day on the log. The steam rose slowly in the rain, but the coffee tasted very strange. It tasted more like the plastic inside the bottle than like coffee beans. It was a flat, chemical taste that stayed on my tongue. I drank it anyway while I stared into the gray fog. I was trying to stop feeling so cold. The rim is a very lonely place. The ground drops down very fast to the valley below, but because of the fog, I could not even see 10 feet down. I started my work. I knelt in the wet plants and used my shovel to put dirt into bags. I labeled them carefully. I wrote North Rim, Sample 7. The rain hit my hat with a steady beat. My jeans were soaked at the knees. I was in no hurry because no one was waiting for me at my empty cabin. I do not know how to explain it well, but out there, being alone feels very tight. The trees look like they are guarding something. The silence is very heavy and is only broken by the sound of your own breathing. That is when I saw him. He was about 30 feet away through the fog. A man was standing perfectly still in the heavy rain. I blinked the water out of my eyes. I thought it was just another hiker who got caught in the storm, but something felt very wrong. He was wearing a flannel shirt and jeans like a local person, but the water was not touching him. The rain was falling very hard in big sheets, but the water seemed to curve around his body. He was completely dry. It was like an invisible bubble was pushing the rain away from him. His shirt looked fresh and dry. His jeans were not wet at all. I sat there with my warm bottle of coffee and watched him. He was staring at some plants. He did not move a single muscle. A feeling of fear started to crawl up my back like cold creek water. I cleared my throat. "Hey there," I yelled. My voice sounded very small in the thick fog. He turned his head toward me. It did not look natural. It was a fast, jerky move like a puppet being pulled by strings. His neck made a sharp noise. His face turned to look at me. His eyes looked like wet, gray stones. He had no pupils at all. They were just flat and gray, staring right through me. Then a sound came from where he was standing. It sounded like dry leaves moving on a road. It was a scratching sound that felt very close, but there was no wind moving the leaves. My heart started beating very fast. I packed my tools as fast as I could. My hands were shaking as I put the bags in my pack. I did not wait for anything. I walked back down the path very quickly. My boots slipped in the mud, but I never looked back over my shoulder. The walk down the hill felt much longer than before. The rain was hitting me even harder. I kept thinking about who he was. There was no other car at the trail when I arrived. There were no footprints in the mud in front of me, and those eyes were as blank as stones from a river. There was no life in them. I kept hearing that sound in my head. It was the sound of leaves scratching. It sounded like whispers I could almost understand. I tripped once and my pack hit my back, but I did not stop. The woods felt like they were getting smaller around me. The branches brushed against me like fingers. The silence was very scary. No animals were moving. There was only the rain and the sound of my breath. I finally reached my truck. My hands were shaking as I used my keys. The engine was hard to start, but it finally did. I drove the curvy road home. My windshield wipers made a slapping sound the whole way. My cabin looked dark. My neighbor's house was far away through the trees. I went inside and locked the door. I made a big fire in the wood stove. The fire was very bright. The hinges made their usual whine snap sound as I added wood. The smell of the grease felt safe, but my mind was not calm. I took off my wet clothes and hung them near the fire. I saw the steam rising from them. I sat in my chair and looked at the fire. I forgot about my coffee on the table. It had gone cold. To be honest, I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light. I tried to think it was just a person in a rain jacket that I did not see correctly. But I knew that was not true. The way the water curved away from him was wrong. The way his head moved was wrong. It was all very wrong. It felt like the valley had made something that looked like a man but forgot the small details. Having no pupils meant there was no soul inside him. There was just emptiness staring at me, and that sound did not come from a mouth. It came from the air around him. It was like the air itself was scratching out a warning to me. I did not sleep at all that night. I stayed in bed and listened to the rain on the roof. I listened for that scratching sound. The next morning was gray and cold. I stayed inside and did not finish my work. I called the university later from the town. I told them I was sick. I only sent them some of the soil samples. They were unhappy with me, but I could not tell them the truth. I could not say, "I saw a dry man in the rain with stone eyes." They would think I was drinking too much alcohol. Many years later, I quit my job as a surveyor. Now I just work on cabins. I fix fences for the local people. I stay away from the deep paths in the woods. I have never gone back to the North Rim. Tourists go up there now. They talk on their phones, but the signal usually disappears quickly. They do not know how heavy the silence is. I know the truth. These hills have strange things in them. There are old mines that make weird noises. There are creeks that seem to flow uphill after a flood. That man was perhaps something left over from a long time ago. He was trying to look like a person, but he was not quite right. The nights feel very long now that I am older. I sit by my stove. The smell of the grease is very thick. The hinges make that whine snap pause sound. When it rains, the memory comes back to me. I remember the water curving around him. I remember the jerky move of his head and his eyes. I wonder if he is still standing there, staring at the plants. Or maybe he has moved on. Maybe he is still dry even in the wet woods. I only take short trips to town to get food. The roads are empty. The trees look like they are standing guard. Sometimes I dream about him.
He turns toward me in the dream, and the scratching sound gets louder. I wake up gasping for air. I reach for my lamp to turn on the light. Being alone is both a good thing and a bad thing. I have no neighbors nearby. I have no one to call. I only have my memories. I think I should have stayed home that day. The mist was trying to warn me. But I had a deadline to meet. Now I have regret that stays with me. I threw away that bottle. The coffee tasted wrong after that day. My cabin is very quiet. It is too quiet. Out there in the woods, there are things waiting. They stay dry even in the heavy rain. I lock my door. I put more wood in the fire. I wait for the sun to come up. I can still hear that sound like leaves on a road.
I hear it in the wind sometimes. I try to ignore it, but it stays with me. These valleys remember things. They do not forget. I stay away from the rim. It is safer that way. Story 4. I believe it was in the autumn of 1996 when this happened. It is hard to keep track of the years now. They seem to pile up like fallen leaves on the ground. My name is Silas. I have lived in these Kentucky hills for more than 70 years. Mostly, I take care of a small piece of land where I used to grow tobacco before the business became difficult. Now, I just fix fences for my neighbors or sell firewood in the town. Back then, I still liked to go camping sometimes. I wanted to get away from my cabin and breathe the fresh air of the wild woods. I did not have any fancy reasons. I just wanted to sit by a fire and let the quiet help my body relax. To be honest, I went alone that weekend because my wife had passed away the year before. The house felt too empty without her. The silence in the house made me hear echoes of old arguments we once had. I packed my old Ford truck with a tent, a cooler of bologna sandwiches, and my dog named Banjo. He was a hound mix and had been with me since he was a very young puppy. I drove to the edge of the Daniel Boone Forest. This is a place where the roads end and the deep valleys seem to swallow you up. There is no cell phone service out there. Even back then, we did not have those phones much. The nearest neighbor's cabin was 4 miles down a very bumpy road. Their lights were too far away to see through the trees at night. You have to park your car and then walk into the woods. Suddenly, it is just you, the dog, and a very heavy silence. It feels like the woods are wrapping a wet blanket around everything. We walked about 2 miles into the forest that afternoon. Banjo ran ahead of me with his nose to the ground. His tail was wagging slowly. The path was one I knew well. It followed a small creek that made soft splashing noises over smooth stones. The ferns along the banks were turning brown because it was autumn. It looked like it might rain all day. The clouds were low and dark, like a bruise, but the rain did not start until after we set up our camp in a small open area. There were oak and maple trees all around us. I set up the tent quickly. I hammered the stakes into the soft dirt. Then I gathered wood for a fire. Banjo smelled the trees around the area as if he owned the land. The air had a sharp, cold smell because winter was coming. It also smelled like the rot of leaves under my feet. I built the fire very carefully. I used small twigs first and then bigger pieces of wood. The flames grew as the sun went down. The woods turned a deep purple color, which is what happens when the sun goes behind the hills. I sat on a log and ate a sandwich. I gave small pieces to Banjo because he was looking at me with sad eyes. It was a simple evening. Nothing seemed wrong, but then the light disappeared and the rain began. It was just a little bit of rain at first, but it was annoying. It made the fire pop and it made my wool blanket wet. I had hung the blanket on a branch to get some air. That blanket was an old one from the army. I bought it at a flea market many years ago. It was very heavy and it scratched my skin, but it was warm when it was dry. I remember standing there by the fire. I used a stick to move the wood. I watched the steam rise from the wool as the rain hit it. The smell of wet wool and wood smoke was very strong. I shook the blanket to keep it from getting too wet. Banjo was fine at first. He was curled up by my feet. But then he sat up. His ears were moving. He made a low, crying sound. It was not his normal bark for squirrels or other animals. I looked over because I thought there was an animal in the bushes. "What is it, boy?" I said softly, but he just stared at the edge of the trees. The hair on his back started to stand up slowly. I looked up then. through the light rain, about 20 yards away, I saw a buck. It looked normal at first. It had big antlers with 8 points. Its fur was the reddish-brown color of the fall season. It stood as still as a statue. It was watching us from the trees. I did not move. I was admiring it. I thought it was very rare to see a deer so close without it running away. But then it took a step toward us. Everything was wrong. It was all wrong. Its back legs were not normal. They had 2 sets of knees. They bent in opposite directions. The front legs moved forward normally, but the back legs bent backward and then snapped straight very quickly. It moved like an old, jerky movie on a television. It moved 1 frame at a time, but it was alive. My stomach felt sick while I watched it. The deer did not run away. It just stepped closer. Its walk was very strange and unnatural. Banjo put his tail between his legs. He crawled under the wooden table I was using as a seat. He did not bark or growl. He just made small, scared noises. He knew he should not try to fight this thing. The buck stopped again. Its neck stretched out very long. It was too long. It moved its head around as if it were smelling the air, but its eyes stayed fixed on me. It was not eating grass, and it was not acting afraid. It was studying me. It looked at me as if I were a piece of a puzzle that did not belong there. Then I heard a sound. A hum came from its throat. It sounded like a woman singing a lullaby to a baby. It was soft and did not have a real tune. The sound went up and down through the rain. I felt very cold. I cannot explain it, but that humming sound did not come from a deer. It was not an animal sound. It sounded too much like a human, but it was flat. It sounded like a voice echoing inside a metal can. I moved back toward the fire. I held a stick in my hand. I forgot about the blanket, which was dripping water on the branch. The humming got louder. The creature's neck stretched even further. Its head tilted from side to side. I ran to my truck. I locked myself inside and turned the heater on high. The windows got foggy very quickly because I was breathing hard. The rain hit the roof like fingers tapping on metal. I wiped the window so I could see out. But it was too dark to see anything past the headlights I turned on. Banjo scratched at the door until I let him in. He curled up on the floor and was shaking. We sat there all night. I turned the engine on sometimes to keep us warm. I could not sleep easily. The humming sound eventually went away, but the feeling that something was wrong stayed with me. It felt very heavy in my chest. I drove away as soon as the sun started to come up. I left my tent and my gear behind. I was home by noon. My cabin was waiting for me at the end of the road. There are no neighbors close to me. An old man named Jenkins lives over the hill, but his house is usually dark at night. I took the things I had left into the house. I started a fire in the wood stove to stop feeling cold. That stove has been my friend since my wife died. It is a heavy iron machine in the corner of my kitchen. I feed it pieces of oak wood that I cut myself. The door hinges make a very specific sound every time I open it. It makes a short squeak, then a long dragging sound, and then a pop at the end. It sounds like the stove is sighing with relief. I could put oil on the hinges, but I like the sound. It is a rhythm in my quiet house. The inside of the stove is covered in soot and grease from years of cooking. I fried sausage in the mornings. The fat splashes and makes black pools in the pan. That smell of grease grows slowly. It is a sharp, meaty smell that mixes with the smell of burnt wood. It stays on the walls and on my flannel shirts even if I try to open the windows. I scrub my pan with salt and a metal cleaner, but the grease just moves around. It leaves shiny spots that glow in the firelight. The top of the stove is a bit bent from the heat. This makes my pans wobble a little bit. When the stove cools down, it makes soft clicking sounds. The metal makes noise in the empty room. I have spent many hours staring at the fire. The hinges make their sound, squeak, drag, pop, as I add more wood. The smell of the grease feels warm and familiar. It makes me feel safe when the world feels wrong. That day, I sat by the stove for a long time. I made coffee on top of it. The smell of the coffee helped me forget the rain and the humming sound, but even in my safe cabin, I could not stop thinking about the deer. I remembered those knees bending backward. I remembered the long neck and the eyes watching me. I did not tell anyone at first. People in town laugh at stories from the woods. They say you are just drinking too much alcohol. But Banjo was different after that night. He would not go hunting anymore. He cried at shadows. He died a year later. They said it was because he was old, but I am not sure. Now, at night, I hear humming in the wind. I lock my doors and keep the fire going. The silence outside feels very heavy. The trees look like they are standing guard. I only take short walks to the barn to get tools. The roads are empty. I dream about that creature stepping toward me with its jerky movements. I wake up sweating. Being alone is very hard. I have no one to call and no family nearby. I think the deep valleys twist things. There are old stories about shapes that are wrong in the dark. I do not go camping anymore. I stay at home. But the memory stays with me. It keeps me awake. That humming sound, it was like a woman's voice, but it was not. I try to forget it, but I cannot. Sometimes the woods call to me in the quiet. I ignore them. I stay near my stove. It is safer here. Tune Fad. I believe it was the summer of 2012 when everything started to feel wrong. But time blurs together in my mind now, like watercolors left in the rain. My name is Vernon. I have lived and worked in these Pennsylvania hills for nearly 65 years. Most of my life, I worked as a handyman for the state parks, clearing old trails and repairing wooden bridges that almost nobody uses anymore. I liked that kind of work. It was quiet, no boss standing over me, just me and the woods stretching out in every direction. If I am honest, I chose those jobs because I wanted to stay away from people after my son moved to the city. The cabin feels too big without hearing him moving around inside it. That day, I was working on a forgotten part of Laurel Ridge. I was cutting back thick plants with my shovel and loppers. This ridge is the kind of place that no longer shows up on maps. The trails have been swallowed by rhododendrons and mountain laurel that grab at your legs like they are alive. There is no cell service up there. Never has been. Even now, with all the new towers everywhere, that place stays dead. The nearest neighbor's shack is 5 miles down a gravel road, and at dusk, you cannot see its lights through the trees. When you hike there alone, the silence feels heavy. It makes your own footsteps sound like something that does not belong. The sky looked angry all morning. Clouds hung low and gray, like smoke from a dying fire. I ignored it at first, thinking I had time to work before it got bad. Around noon, the rain started. It poured down hard and cold, soaking everything. The trail turned to thick mud that pulled at my boots with every step. I pulled out my old iPhone, the one with a cracked screen from when I dropped it into the creek last spring, to check the weather radar. The screen flickered once, showed blurry red storm shapes, then went black. Either the battery died, or water leaked in again. I muttered a curse and shoved it back into my pocket. There was no real shelter on that ridge. No cabins, no rock overhangs, just endless green closing in from all sides. I kept walking, shovel on my shoulder, rain dripping off my hat, searching for a thick patch of bushes where I could wait it out. That was when I saw it. I pushed through a wall of rhododendrons, branches snapping wet against my arms. In a small clearing, no more than 10 feet wide, there stood a doorframe. It stood all by itself. No walls, no roof, just a solid oak frame, planted straight into the mud as if it had grown there. There was no foundation, no broken building, no ruins. The ground around it was flat, covered with ferns and dead leaves. The door was heavy and dark, polished wood, with a brass knob shining like someone had cleaned it that morn. Rain hammered everything around it, but the frame stood firm, water running cleanly off the top beam. I stopped moving. My heart beat strangely in my chest. Who would bring a door out here? There were no tire tracks, no trail wide enough for a truck. I walked slowly around it, my boots sinking into mud, looking closely. The backside was plain wood, rough grain and knots. Nothing special. But when I stepped back to the front, I heard something. Television static. At first it was faint, like an old TV with poor signal. Then came voices, cheerful and muffled. A game show host talking, joking with contestants. I heard laughter and thin applause, distant and hollow. I froze. There are no power lines on that ridge. No generators. I walked behind the door again. Nothing. No wires. No battery. Just wood standing in the dirt. When I stepped back to the front, the knob had turned slightly. The door was open maybe an inch. The gap was dark, but the sound was clearer now. Then the smell hit me. Frying bacon. Hot, greasy, strong. It mixed with the smell of wet earth and pine needles. My stomach growled, even though fear crawled up my spine. It was wrong. All of it was wrong. I took a step back and tightened my grip on the shovel. The static cracked, and the host's voice said, "Come on down," like it was inviting me inside. Every instinct screamed that it was a trap. Step through, and what would happen? Those hills hide strange things. Old mine shafts, sinkholes, creeks that vanish overnight. But this felt different. I cannot explain it well. It felt like the ridge had folded something into itself, like a tear where the feeling of home was leaking through in the wrong place. I left my shovel there. I turned around and walked. It took me 3 miles to get back, and darkness was falling fast. Rain soaked me to the bone. My flashlight cut weak yellow lines through the storm. There were no birds, no animals, just silence, broken by my breathing and the sucking sound of mud under my boots. My mind would not stop. I kept imagining the door swinging open behind me, the smell of bacon following. I finally reached my truck. The engine struggled, but started. I drove the winding road home, windshield wipers beating time, my cabin appearing at the end of the lane like a safe harbor. Inside, I locked the door. It is an old pine door with a screen nailed onto it. The hinges have a sound I know by heart. I have oiled them 100 times, but they still complain. When you push the door open, they make a high whining sound. When you pull it closed, the sound drags low, ending with a soft click as the latch catches. The screen is patched with duct tape where squirrels chewed holes. The frame swells in summer humidity, so you have to shove it with your shoulder. Every morning, I open it wide for fresh air, the hinges singing their whine drag click, letting in the sound of the creek. At night, it rattles gently in the wind, steady like a heartbeat. That evening, soaked and shaking, I ignored the door and went straight to the kitchen. I lit the wood stove. The cast iron skillet sat on top, still greasy from breakfast eggs. As it warmed, that old fat smell rose, sharp and smoky, soaked into the iron from years of sausage and onions. I cleaned that skillet with hot water and a stiff brush. No soap. It ruins the seasoning. The grease stays, black and shiny, hiding in the metal, flaring if it gets too hot. I poured coffee and watched the steam curl. The stove door creaked when I added wood, making the same wine drag sound. Those normal noises helped ground me. They pushed the memory of the door away, but the feeling of wrongness stayed. I slept badly that night. I dreamed of turning the knob, stepping into white static light. I woke sweating while rain still tapped the roof. I called in sick the next day. Told my supervisor it was a stomach bug. The truth was, I could not face the ridge. Weeks passed. I fixed fences for old lady Harlan down the road. Her place is a mile away, no phone line. We hill people live quiet lives, but after that day, the silence started to eat at me. I wondered if the door was still there, humming game shows to an empty forest. I tried telling my son once, during one of his rare calls from the city. He laughed and said, "Dad, you need a TV out there." But his voice faded, like he did not want to hear more. Nights feel longer as you get older. I sit by the stove. The skillet cools after supper, grease smell hanging in the air. The screen door squeaks when the wind rises. Wine drag click, reminding me how thin the line between safety and the outside really is. I make short trips to town for supplies. The roads are empty. The trees feel like they are watching. I dream of the door standing open, bacon calling. I wake reaching for the light. That smell, comforting, like home, but wrong in the wild. I try to shake it off. Sometimes I can't. That ridge is still out there, waiting. I stay away.
3-6.
I think it was late in the autumn of 2009. The exact year is hard to remember now because all the years blend together like wet leaves in a gutter. My name is Amos. I have lived in these West Virginia valleys since the day I was born. I am 73 years old now, and I can feel the rainy mornings in my painful knees. Back then, I worked the night shift at the paper mill. I operated the large rollers until my hands were always stained with ink. It did not matter how much I scrubbed them, the ink stayed. On that Tuesday, I had worked 2 shifts in a row. I finished around midnight. I stopped at the Shell gas station on Route 52 to get gas and a bag of cheap beef jerky. They keep it behind the counter. It is very tough and feels more like leather than meat. You have to chew it for a long time, and it still feels hard. I plan to eat it slowly on my drive home to help me relax after work. There is a parking area for the gorge near the New River. It is a place that people do not use very often, except for hunters or people who want to look at the water in silence. I parked there that night. I let the engine run quietly. The rain began to hit the roof of my Jeep with a steady sound. There was no cell phone service out there. The nearest house was 4 miles away toward the town. The lights were too far away to see in the dark. It was just me, the rain, and a very heavy silence. It felt as if the trees were listening for a secret that I did not want to tell. I used my teeth to tear open the bag of jerky. The plastic made a loud noise inside the car. The meat was as dry as old bootlaces. It was salty and had a lot of pepper. It stuck to my gums as I chewed. I chewed slowly and my jaw worked hard. I thought that I might break a tooth one day, but I kept buying it because it was a habit. The rain came down the windshield in sheets. I turned the wipers off, so the world outside looked like blurry streaks. I sat there for a while. I let the heater blow warm air to stop the cold that was coming through the floor. The gorge drops down very steeply just past the parking lot. I could hear the water roaring quietly far below, but the trees blocked most of the sound. I was not in a hurry to go home. My cabin has been empty since my wife died. The wood stove stays cold unless I decide to start a fire. That is when I saw them. I saw 2 golden lights in the trees about 30 yards away. They were steady and did not blink. At first, I thought they were reflections. I thought my headlights were bouncing off wet leaves or a puddle. I reached over and turned the lights off. The inside of the Jeep became dark, and only the light from the dashboard was visible. The golden lights stayed there. They did not get dim and they did not move. They just stayed there, bright and golden against the dark pine trees. I leaned forward. My breath made the glass foggy. The lights were too high to be a coyote. They were too far apart to be a bobcat. They were at least 7 feet off the ground. That is higher than any bears standing up. I could not see a shape or a body around them. I only saw the eyes floating above the ferns and bushes. The rain kept falling. It hit the roof like someone tapping their fingers because they were impatient. The eyes did not blink. I sat there frozen. I had a piece of jerky halfway to my mouth. Then I felt a strange pressure. It started slowly. It felt like someone was pressing their thumbs against my eardrums. It did not hurt, but it felt very heavy. It felt like I was sinking deep underwater. My ears began to pop slowly. The car felt smaller and the air felt thicker. Then a third eye opened. It opened right in the middle, where a forehead would be if there were a face. It was the same gold color. It was burning steadily. It had no eyelids and no pupils. There were 3 points of light staring right through my windshield. There was no sound except for the rain. There was no growling and no moving in the bushes. There was only the steady and endless sound of the rain. The piece of jerky in my hand became very cold. It was not just cool, it was freezing cold, like it had been pulled out of ice. It became slimy and felt wrong against my fingers. The grease became slick and disgusting. I dropped it on the seat. I wiped my palm on my jeans, but the feeling stayed. It felt as if the meat remembered something that it should not know. I looked for my key and turned it. The engine started roughly. The headlights snapped back on. The eyes did not move. They did not flinch at the bright light. They just watched me. I put the Jeep in reverse. I backed away slowly. The gravel made a crunching sound under my tires. The 3 lights stayed in the same spot. They watched me as if they were nailed to the glass of my windshield. I reached the road and started driving forward. I did not look in the mirror. I just drove. The rain made everything blurry. The wipers moved back and forth. The pressure in my ears went away slowly as I drove away from that parking area. But the memory stayed with me. It felt sharp like a splinter in my mind. Eventually, I reached the highway. I saw the lights of other cars and the yellow glow from the streetlights. I pulled into the parking lot of a diner that stays open all night. I sat there shaking until the heater made me warm again. I have never gone back to that parking lot by the gorge. Not even once. I went home that night to my old cabin at the end of a dirt road. My neighbor's house is over the hill, but it is too far away to see any smoke from their fire. I locked the door with a bolt. I started a big fire in the wood stove, even though the night was not very cold. That stove has been my constant friend since I was a young boy. It is made of heavy black metal and sits in the corner. I use wood that I cut myself. The hinges on the door make a noise every time I open it. First, there is a short, high sound like a mosquito. Then there is a long, low sound as the metal moves. It ends with a soft metal pop when the door closes. I have put oil on the hinges many times, but the sound never stops. It is a sound I know very well. Inside the stove, the coals glow orange. The top of the stove is greasy because I have fried many eggs and bacon on it for years. That grease builds up slowly. It looks like dark marks in the metal. It smells sharp and like meat. It smells like old pork left in a pan too long. I clean it with hot water and a metal scrubber. I do not use soap because it would ruin the metal, but the grease just moves around and leaves shiny spots that reflect the firelight. When the stove gets hot, the grease makes popping sounds. Little bits of smoke come up and hurt your eyes if you get too close. I stood there that night and put more wood inside. The hinges made their usual sounds: whine, groan, and pop. The smell was very comforting. It was thick and familiar. It helped push away the cold feeling from the gorge. But even with the big fire, I kept looking at the windows. I was afraid those golden lights would appear in the glass. I slept in my chair that night. I kept my blanket pulled tight around me. My dreams were not peaceful. I dreamed of 3 golden eyes floating in the bushes. They watched me while I chewed jerky that turned into cold slime in my mouth. I woke up before the sun came up. My heart was beating fast. The fire in the stove had almost gone out. I did not tell anyone at first. People in town would have laughed at me. They would say I was tired from work or that the jerky was bad. But the pressure in my ears stayed for several days. My ears popped whenever I swallowed. It felt like my head had not come back from a great depth. I kept the bag of jerky in my Jeep for many weeks. I could not touch it again. Many years have passed, and I still drive past that parking area sometimes. The road goes close enough for me to see it from the highway. I never stop there. I never look at it for a long time, but I feel the eyes sometimes when I am in quiet places between towns. I feel 3 lights in the dark, waiting for me. Being alone makes it worse. I have no neighbors nearby and no phone to call for help. It is just me and the trees. The trees stay silent and hold on to whatever is wrong inside them. The nights feel very long now. I sit by my stove. The hinges make their noise and the smell of grease is thick. When it rains on the roof, I remember everything. I remember the sound of the rain, the eyes, and the slime in my hand. I only take short trips to the store for milk or bread. I do not stay on the roads after it gets dark. I still dream of the gorge. I wake up and reach for the light switch immediately. Those eyes were not hunting for food. They were measuring me. They were trying to understand what I was made of. I can forget about it in the daylight, but I cannot forget at night. Something is waiting in the bushes. I lock my doors. I keep the fire going in the stove. I wait for the morning to come. The pressure in my ears still happens sometimes when the house is too quiet. I turn up the radio to drown out the silence. But the memory stays. It keeps me awake. That Tuesday night changed how I see the dark. Before that night, the dark was just empty. Now, I know the dark watches me back. I saw 3 lights. They were too high and too steady. I am never going back there. So sad. I am not the kind of man who tells stories just to hear his own voice. I have lived in these hills my whole life, and most days pass quiet, like a grave no one visits anymore. But there is one thing, one memory. It comes back to me when the nights grow long. It has been almost 30 years now, but it still wakes me sometimes, my heart pounding like I have run through thorns for miles. I do not know why I am telling it now. Maybe it is because my bones ache more these days, reminding me that time is running short. Or maybe it is because someone should understand why I never go near that old orchard anymore. My granddad used to say that some places in these mountains feel wrong. He said the ground remembers things that should stay buried. He warned me to stay away from that spot near the park line, said it was not a place for curious people. But I was young then, stubborn. I thought I knew better. That spring was a wet one. The creek swelled and washed out dirt roads, leaving deep ruts that could swallow a truck tire. I was working in the shed, fixing an old wooden trunk. It was a pine box my mother used to keep linens in before she died. The hinges were rusted through, flaking red like dried blood. I needed replacements, old strong ones like they used to make. Around here, we do not waste things. We reuse what we can. I remembered the abandoned orchard down in the hollow, where the national park meets our land. The apple trees there had grown wild and twisted. I thought there might be old farm junk lying around. Gates, barn doors, anything with iron hinges I could pull off. Granddad's warning echoed in my head as I tied my boots. Stay away from that place. But the rain had slowed to a light mist, and I had my old hunting knife on my belt. The blade was pitted, but sharp enough. I threw a canvas sack over my shoulder and started out, thinking it would be a short trip. The walk took me through the woods behind the house, down a narrow path made by deer and the rare hiker who does not know they are trespassing. There is no cell service there, not even a weak signal. The nearest neighbor lives 3 miles down the hollow, Widow Jenkins. She keeps to herself. The trees grow thick there. Oaks and hickories press close together, blocking the sky and making the world feel small. The silence is not peaceful. It feels like it is watching you, waiting. My boots sank into the mud with every step. Mist clung to my flannel shirt until it stuck to my skin. I stopped now and then to breathe, listening to water dripping from leaves. There were no birds, no animals, just heavy quiet. I stopped at the edge of the orchard. The ground was covered with fallen branches and old rotten apples, crushed underfoot into sour mush. The air smelled clean and earthy, the way it does after light rain. I searched around the edges first, looking for metal. I found a few nails in a stump, but nothing useful. As I went deeper, the mist grew thicker. It curled around the trees like smoke from a dying fire. That was when I noticed the old well, half hidden by vines and thorny bushes. It was lined with stone, probably dug long ago when the orchard was cared for. Granddad had mentioned it once, said it had gone dry years back, but folks avoided it anyway. I stepped closer, thinking there might be an old bucket or pulley with hinges I could take. Then the smell hit me. It cut through the damp earth like a knife. It was lilies, but rotten, like flowers left too long at a funeral. Strong, sweet, and decayed at the same time. The kind meant to cover the smell of death. It coated my tongue and burned my eyes. I gagged and covered my nose with my sleeve. There are no lilies growing wild there. Not in spring. Not ever. The mist carried the smell, wrapping around me. My heart began to beat faster. The orchard suddenly felt wrong, like the air had grown heavy and was pressing down. I froze. I heard a sound, wet, slow, like bare feet slapping through deep mud. It was coming from near the well. My hand went to the knife. The metal felt cold, but it steadied me. I listened hard. The mist swallowed everything else. Slap, 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 slow, careful. Whatever it was not rushing. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, a raccoon, a possum. But animals do not move like that. Not with that rhythm. I stepped back, eyes fixed on the well. The smell grew stronger, thick, choking. Then I saw it. It was crouched low, covered in something that looked like raw skin, with shiny, not cured, not right. It was not a man, not an animal either. Its body bent in ways that made no sense. Limbs too long, joints wrong. At first, it faced away. Then I heard the clicking, teeth snapping together, fast and sharp, like an old typewriter hammering keys. Click, click, click. No pause, no breath. I could not move. The thing shifted. Its skin rippled like it was still fresh. The slapping stopped, but the clicking continued. It rose slightly, not standing fully, but enough to twist my stomach. I backed away slowly, 1 foot at a time, begging the leaves not to crunch. I held the knife so tight my hand hurt. That smell clung to me, into my clothes, into my skin. I kept backing up until the trees hid it from view. The clicking faded. Then the slapping started again, quieter. That was when I turned and ran. Branches tore at my face. I did not stop until I was clear of the orchard and back on the path. My lungs burned. The mist thinned as I hurried home, but the smell stayed with me for hours. When I reached the house, I locked the door. I sat by the wood stove and stared at the fire until it burned down to embers. The house felt empty, too quiet. There was no wife to tell, no children, just me and the creaking floorboards. I did not sleep that night. I kept the knife under my pillow like a fool. Let me tell you about that wood stove, because small things help a man hold on to reality. It is an old cast iron stove in the kitchen corner, black, pitted, scarred by years of heat. Every morning, I feed it oak and hickory, wood that burns slow and hot. But it is the skillet on top that stays with me. It has been used for generations. Layers of grease baked into it until it shines smooth. The smell is old grease, almost sour, mixed with iron and smoke. When it heats up, the scent fills the room and clings to everything. The stove door hinges squeak when you open them. A high whine, then a low groan. Squeak groan. Squeak groan. I have oiled them many times, but the damp air always rusts them again. The ash pan scrapes when you pull out, gray dust falling onto your boots. That stove has carried me through harsh winters and burning summers. It is boring, ordinary, but that night, the smell of grease and the sound of those hinges reminded me that some things still make sense. Days turned into weeks. I fixed the trunk with new store-bought hinges. They felt wrong, too clean, too bright. I never went back to the orchard. Granddad's warning finally made sense. I stayed busy, chopping wood, working the garden, but the memory came back when the rain fell light and misty. Sometimes I caught a faint floral smell on the wind, and my stomach would tighten. Maybe it was in my head, maybe not. I still do not know what I saw. Could it have been a person? Someone hiding? Maybe. But that clicking was not human. Months later, I sat on the porch one evening. The sun set orange over the hills. A whippoorwill called in the distance. Then I heard it again. Slap, slap, faint, wait, coming from the woods. The smell followed. I went inside and locked the doors. I did not sleep. Over the years, it returned sometimes. Not often, just enough, while carrying water, while fixing fence. That feeling would brush past me. Isolation makes it worse. Sound dies in the trees. You feel alone in the world. I think whatever lives in that orchard stays there because it is far from people. But it knows when someone is close. It waits. I told a friend once. He laughed, said it was bears or drug users. Maybe. But he has not felt the air turn thick. Now I am older. The house feels bigger, emptier. I stay close. The orchard still sits there, I suppose. Apples rotting, the well hidden in vines. The clicking comes in my dreams now. Click, click, like it is spelling my name. Some nights I lie awake, listening, waiting for the slapping sound. It is still out there, wrong, waiting. But I will not go back. Never. The mist comes in sometimes, even on the porch. It carries that smell. I close my eyes and breathe through my mouth. It passes. The memory does not. Wrongness in the hollow. Best left alone. Story 8. I have lived in these Smoky Mountains my whole life. I live in a small valley where the fog is very thick almost every morning. I used to think of myself as a photographer when my hands were steady and my eyes were sharp. I mostly took pictures of the land. I photographed creeks flowing over rocks and tall hemlock trees standing against the sky. I sold a few of those pictures to tourists in the town of Gatlinburg. It was enough money to keep my wood stove filled with wood, but there is one trip I took that still bothers me. It keeps me awake at night. I sit and stare out the window into the darkness. To be honest, I think that trip is the reason I stopped being a photographer. I have not touched my camera since that day. It was late in the fall. The leaves were turning a rusty red and gold color. The rain had been falling steadily for many days. It was a kind of light rain that slowly soaks through your coat. It makes everything slippery and miserable. I had an idea for a photo that I thought would look like art. I wanted to take a long exposure picture of the rain falling through the hemlock trees. I wanted the raindrops to look like silver threads. I thought it would look very pretty if I printed it. I packed my tools in my old truck. It is a truck with rusty fenders and a tailgate that makes a loud noise over every bump in the road. I drove to a spot deep in the park. It is a place where the trails are very thin and people do not usually go. There is no cell phone service out there. My nearest neighbor lives many miles away. The roads are twisty and they flood easily. It was just me and the trees. The silence felt very heavy, as if the trees were holding their breath. I walked into the woods for a while. My boots made squishing sounds in the mud. My backpack was heavy because of my tripod and my camera lenses. The air had a clean smell like wet pine trees and dirt. I found an open area under the hemlock trees. Their branches were hanging low because they were heavy with water. I set up my equipment quickly. My fingers were numb from the cold. I had an old flashlight with a handle covered in tape. It flickered a little bit, but it worked well enough to see my camera. I looked at my digital watch. It said 4:12 p.m. I thought I had about 1 hour of light left before it became completely dark. I pressed the button on my camera to start the picture. The rain made a steady sound on the leaves. I waited and counted the seconds in my head, but something felt very strange. The numbers on my watch did not move. It still said 4:12. I tapped the watch because I thought the battery was dying. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, but it said the same thing. It was 4:12 p.m. and the time was frozen. I stood there in the rain and stared at the screen. I waited for what felt like 20 minutes. I walked around a little bit to stay warm, but the time did not change. The rain started to look wrong. It was hanging in the air. It was falling so slowly that it looked like thick syrup. The raindrops were just hanging there, shaking in the middle of the air. I blinked my eyes and rubbed them. The world had become very quiet. The trees seemed to swallow every sound. The only thing I could hear was my own breathing. Then I heard a voice behind me. It was my own voice. It said, "You shouldn't be here yet." I turned around very fast. There was nothing there. There were only empty woods and trees in the mist. But the trees looked different now. They looked like they were made of wax. They were smooth and did not look natural. The branches were hanging in ways that did not make sense. There was no texture on the bark. The trees were just shiny and caught the dim light. I felt very cold. The rain was still frozen as it fell slowly. Then I felt a cold hand touch the back of my neck. It felt like cold fingers moving across my skin. I dropped my camera. I ran away as fast as I could. I tripped over roots in the ground, but I got up and kept moving. My heart was beating very fast in my chest. Everything looked blurry, but I did not stop. My lungs felt like they were burning. When I finally reached my truck, I pulled the door open and fell inside. I put the key in the ignition and started the engine. The clock on the dashboard was blinking. It jumped from 4:12 straight to 6:45. It felt like no time had passed for me, but hours had actually gone by. I drove home shaking. My headlights cut through the darkness. A bad headache started that night. Now, my head hurts behind my eyes every time it rains. That happened almost 20 years ago, but the memory does not fade. I live alone in a house on the side of a hill. The logs of the house are old and gray. I do not have any fancy technology. I only have the basics. My front screen door has been there since my father's time. The hinges make a sound that I know very well. It is a two-part sound. First, there is a high-pitched squeak when you pull it open. Then there is a low groan when it swings back. Finally, there is a loud click when the latch catches. The spring is old, so it does not close fast. It closes slowly, and the squeak lasts a long time on humid days. There is red rust on the metal that stains your fingers if you touch it. I put oil on it sometimes, but the mountain air makes it rusty again very quickly. The screen has holes that are patched with tape. Sometimes a fly gets into the kitchen. When the wind is strong, the door rattles. The hinges make short sounds like they are complaining about the cold. The door is nothing special. It is just a door. But after nights when I remember that scary day, I listen to it. I open and close it on purpose. I count the sounds: squeak, groan, click. It is real and I can predict it. There is nothing wrong with the door. The paint is chipped near the handle. In the mornings, the sun makes the hinges look orange, but in the evenings, they look dark and silent. I have heard that sound 1,000 times. It is very boring, but it makes me feel safe. It keeps the world feeling normal when my head starts to hurt from the sound of rain on the roof. I tried to forget what happened at first. I worked very hard on my chores. I split wood for the stove and carried water from the creek. But the headaches are very strong now. They are worst in the fall when it rains a lot. It feels like my head is being squeezed. I see visions of those wax trees. I hear that voice, my own voice, but not really me. I do not know how to explain it. It is like an echo from a place where time does not work correctly. I went back to that spot one time, many years later. I could not stop myself. I parked my truck in the same place and walked in slowly. The area was there. The trees looked normal and the bark was rough. I found my camera buried in the leaves. The lens was cracked, but the camera body was okay. I looked at the memory card, but it was blank. There was not a single picture on it. My watch and phone worked normally that day, but as I stood there, the air became very heavy. The silence started to close in on me. It started to rain lightly. The raindrops seemed to slow down just a little bit. I ran away immediately and did not look back. The nights are very long for me now. I do not have a good TV signal and I do not have internet. I just listen to the fire in the stove. I watch the shadows on the walls. I sit in my rocking chair and listen to the trees in the wind. I feel like they are watching me. There is something wrong hiding in the valleys where the light does not reach. I think that is why people disappear sometimes. Hikers go missing and no one can find them. All they find are echoes. To be honest, I wonder if that voice was me from a different time warning myself. Or maybe it was something pretending to be me to play a trick. The feeling of that cold hand is still in my dreams. It feels like ice moving down my back. I stay away from the deep woods now. I stay in my yard and my garden. But when the rain hits the roof, my headache grows. I hear that voice very quietly. It says, "You shouldn't be here yet." What does it mean? Does it mean I arrived too early for my own death? My truck is rusting and the tires are flat. I do not drive anymore. It is too far to the town. My nearest neighbor is a widow who lives a mile away. We do not visit each other. Being alone is better for me now. It keeps the world away, but it also makes the quiet very loud. Every noise in the house sounds like a footstep. During a storm last year, the power went out. I sat by a lantern. The rain was very loud. Time seemed to stretch out. I checked my old watch. The hands were stuck at 4:12. I waited and I was sweating even though it was cold. Then the hands jumped ahead several hours. My head felt like it was splitting open. Everything is wrong. I keep my lantern low to save oil. The silence from the trees outside presses against my windows. It feels like the trees are leaning in to listen to me. Sometimes I think I hear footsteps in the mud, but I tell myself it is just the rain. But I am not sure. I do not go outside after dark. I lock my door, even though the lock is not very strong. The voice is waiting for me. It is my own voice. It says I should not be here yet, but I am here, and it knows I am here. The headaches happen more often now. It does not matter if it is raining or not. I think my time is catching up to me. I do not know what will happen next. I just sit here and listen to the screen door move in the wind. I am waiting. These mountains have secrets in the deep places. I have lived here long enough to know that some things should not be seen. That afternoon in the rain opened a hole in the world. It let me see something wrong. Time frozen and wax trees. It is all stuck in my head. I tried to talk to a park ranger once. He was an old man who chewed tobacco. He laughed and said I just spent too much time alone. But his eyes changed when I told him where I was. He said there had been other reports of people feeling watched. He said some clocks had acted strangely there. He did not say anything else. He just tipped his hat and left. I dream of running through those woods. I try to move, but I am very slow, like I am walking through syrup. The cold hand grabs my neck. I wake up gasping for air, and my sheets are twisted. The house makes noises as it gets older. Or maybe it is something else. I have no phone to call for help. No one is near me. It is just me and the memory. It keeps me awake. The days and nights all feel the same. The rain is coming again. I can feel it in my body. My headache is starting. The voice is whispering, yet. I was younger then. I thought the mountains belonged to me. I thought I could capture them in my photos. I drove my truck fast and listened to loud music, but the silence in the mountains always wins. It swallows all sounds. It leaves you alone with your own thoughts. I set up that shot with my shaky hands. The tape on my flashlight was rough. The camera clicked, and then time slipped away. It slipped away like a fish getting off a hook. The rain was in slow motion. Every drop looked like a ball of light. The voice came from nowhere. It sounded exactly like me. It told me I should not be here yet. I turned so fast I almost hurt my ankle. The woods were empty, but they did not feel empty. The trees were wrong and looked like melted candles. The hand touched my neck. I ran. I lost my camera and did not find it until much later. There was a jump in time when I got to my truck. Now I am older and I am tired. My bones hurt when the weather changes. The memory is as sharp as a thorn. I talk to the fire sometimes, but the words are lost. No one is listening to me, but the wrongness is still there in the mountains. It is best to leave it alone. The creek behind my house makes noise after the rain, but I do not go there to fish anymore. It is too close to the woods. Being alone is like a heavy blanket that smothers me. At night, I count my breaths. I am waiting for the cold. It will come. If I am being honest, I am afraid of it. But I cannot run anymore. I just sit here. I listen to the squeak of the door. It is real. It keeps me on the ground until it doesn't. Story 9. I have spent almost my entire life walking these Appalachian Mountains, living off what the land gives and helping people when they get in trouble. For 12 years, I worked with search and rescue. We were the ones called when someone got lost, hurt, or stuck where they should not have gone. I pulled hikers out with broken legs, hunters who wandered off in fog, and once even helped carry a man who had been attacked by a bear. I thought I had seen everything the mountains could show a person. I thought I was ready for anything, but there is one call out, one day near the Oconaluftee River, that still wakes me up at night. I wake with my heart pounding and my back soaked in cold sweat. If I am being honest, that day is the reason I quit the team and never went back. I do not know how to explain it without sounding crazy, but it settled deep inside me like something rotten. It has been about 15 years now, but when the wind howls through the trees or the rain falls hard, I hear it again in my head. It makes me wonder what really lives in these woods, where the silence feels heavy and no one is close enough to hear you scream. That week had been nothing but rain. It poured day after day, turning dirt roads into mud and creeks into raging rivers. The Oconaluftee was swollen and angry, brown water smashing into rocks and tearing at the banks like it wanted to escape. We got a call about a missing hiker. His name was Mark, I think. One of those out-of-town folks who come chasing waterfalls or quiet. He was last seen near the river trail. We all guessed he slipped on wet rocks and got hurt. I was at my cabin when the radio crackled to life. Static hissed like insects before the dispatcher spoke. My good boots were still drying from the day before, sitting near the wood stove. Mud covered them thick, dried and cracked, falling off in flakes. So I put on my old Crocs instead. Ugly things, still muddy from yard work, but they grip well enough on slick ground. I grabbed my pack with bandages, splints, flares, and clipped my radio to my belt. I drove out to the trailhead, the truck tires spinning in deep ruts. There is no cell service out there. Never has been. The nearest neighbor lives 4 miles away, an old man with hounds who mostly keeps to himself. As soon as you enter the woods, the trees close in. Their branches meet overhead, and the world becomes quiet. Too quiet. Like the forest is holding its breath. I hiked in alone at first, planning to scout while the rest of the team gathered. Rain soaked through my jacket and made my shirt cling cold to my skin. The river roared nearby, loud enough to drown out almost every other sound. I shouted the hiker's name again and again. My voice bounced off the ridges, but nothing answered except the water. The trail followed the riverbank, roots twisting across the path like traps. My Crocs squished in the mud, my toes numb from cold. I stopped at a bend in the trail to catch my breath. That was when I heard the voice. "Help me. I've broken my leg." It was clear, desperate, a man's voice. But it came from 2 directions at the same time. One voice came from up on the ridge, distant but clear. The other came from down by the river, close enough to feel near. Same words, same pain, same pause for breath. I froze. My heart started racing. At first, I thought maybe it was an echo. Maybe the river was playing tricks. But no, it was too perfect, too exact. I took a step toward the river, slipping on wet leaves. "Help me," both voices called again. Exactly the same. Wrong. Then the voices changed. The voice from the ridge turned high and small. A little girl's voice now, scared and crying. "Help me, I've broken my leg." The river voice stayed a man's voice, deep and hurting. I stopped moving. It felt like something was testing me, changing its sound to see what would pull me in. The girl's voice twisted something deep in my chest, but the timing stayed perfect. Practicing. My hand went to the radio. My mouth felt dry. The voices overlapped now. Man and child. Same words. Same rhythm. I pressed the radio button. "This is Jeb. I'm hearing calls for help from 2 places at once. Something's wrong. I need backup now." Static crackled back. Then a voice said they were on the way. I leaned against a tree, watching the ridge, then the river. The calling continued, but the voices shifted again. Now an old woman's rough voice came from the water, a child's whimper from above. Trying different sounds, learning. Rain ran down my neck, but I did not move. Then the voices stopped. In their place came a sound. A steady thumping, like someone hitting hollow wood. It came from both directions at first. Then it blended into one sound and slowly faded into the forest. When the team arrived about 20 minutes later, the woods were silent. I told them everything. They listened, exchanged looks, but we searched anyway. We searched until darkness fell. We found no hiker, no footprints, no signs at all. The report later said it was an echo, sound bouncing off the river and ridges. But I know better. I drove home in the dark, rain still falling. The cabin waited quietly. The wood stove glowed faint through the window. I locked the door and sat by the fire, staring at the flames. That radio I carried that day still sits on a shelf. It is old and scratched. The plastic case is cracked. The antenna is bent. The buttons stick because dirt worked into the seams years ago. When you turn it on, it hums softly, then beeps sharp and loud before filling with static. The volume knob grinds when you turn it. The battery door barely holds shut, taped together. Inside, the metal contacts are green with corrosion. It smells like sweat and old electronics. It is a boring thing, just a tool. But after that day, I would sit under the lamp at night and turn it on, listening to empty channels. When the static popped, my stomach would twist, waiting for that double voice. It never came, just noise. That radio felt real, predictable, unlike what I heard in the woods. I tried to keep working after that, but every shout in the forest made me pause. I kept listening for echoes that should not exist. The team noticed. They joked that I was jumpy. I quit not long after, told them my knees were giving out. The truth was, I could not trust my ears anymore. I live quiet now, alone in my cabin. I grow potatoes and beans. I keep the stove going in winter. The isolation helps, but it also hurts. No phone signal, no visitors unless they walk miles. Trees press close to the house, their branches scraping in the wind. The dreams come often. I am back by the river. Voices pull from every side. Man, girl, old woman. Sometimes they sound like me. The thumping grows closer. I wake gasping. Years later, I went back once, alone, wearing proper boots. I stood near the river and listened. A whisper floated through the air. Help me. One voice. Then a faint echo. I ran. The hiker was never found. People say he fell into the river. Animals. Accidents. I wonder. Sometimes, when I'm chopping wood, I hear that thumping again. I stop and listen. Nothing. But I know it is there. Waiting. Rain brings it back the strongest. When water drums on the roof and the river roars in memory, I sit by the stove and think about that day. About the choice I did not make. If I had followed the voice. Gone like him. The mountains keep secrets. Voices in the hollows, sounds that learn. I stay inside more now. I lock the door at dusk. The radio stays silent. But the memory does not. It waits, just like whatever is out there. Story time. I have lived almost my entire life walking through these mountains. I lived by using what the land gave me. I also spent a lot of time helping people when they got into trouble. For 12 years, I was a member of a group called Search and Rescue. We were the people who were called when someone was lost, hurt, or stuck in a place where they were not supposed to be. I helped hikers who had broken their legs. I helped hunters who got lost in the thick fog. One time, I even helped carry a man who had been attacked by a bear. I believed that I had seen everything these mountains could show a person. I thought that I was prepared for anything that could happen, but there is one time I was called out to help that I cannot forget. It happened near a river called the Oconaluftee River. This day still causes me to wake up in the middle of the night. I wake up with my heart beating very fast. My back is always wet with cold sweat. If I am being honest, that day is the reason I left the team. I never went back to help again. I do not know how to explain what happened without sounding like I am crazy. But that experience stayed deep inside me like something that has gone bad. It has been about 15 years since that day. However, when the wind blows through the trees or when it rains very hard, I hear those sounds again in my head. It makes me wonder what actually lives in these woods. In these woods, the silence feels very heavy. No one is close enough to hear you if you scream for help. That entire week, it did nothing but rain. It rained day after day. The rain turned the dirt roads into thick mud. It turned small creeks into very fast and dangerous rivers. The Oconaluftee River was very high and looked very angry. The brown water was hitting the rocks very hard. It was tearing at the sides of the river as if it wanted to escape. We received a call about a hiker who was missing. I think his name was Mark. He was a person from a big city. People like him often come to the mountains to see waterfalls or to find a quiet place. Someone saw him for the last time near the trail by the river. We all thought that he probably slipped on the wet rocks and got hurt. I was at my small cabin when the radio started making noise. It made a static sound like the noise of many insects. Then the person who sends the messages began to speak. My good boots were still wet from the day before. They were sitting near the wood stove to dry. They were covered in thick mud. The mud was dry and was falling off in small pieces. Because my boots were wet, I put on my old plastic shoes called Crocs. They were not pretty shoes, and they were still muddy from working in the yard, but they were good at gripping the ground when it was slippery. I grabbed my bag that had bandages, tools for broken bones, and lights. I clipped my radio to my belt. I drove to the start of the trail. My truck tires were spinning in the deep mud. There is no cell phone service in that area. There has never been any service there. The closest neighbor lives 4 miles away. He is an old man who has dogs and stays by himself. As soon as you walk into the woods, the trees feel like they are surrounding you. Their branches meet at the top like a roof. The world becomes very quiet. It is too quiet. It feels like the forest is holding its breath and waiting for something to happen. I started walking into the woods alone at first. I wanted to look around while the rest of the team gathered together. The rain soaked through my jacket. It made my shirt feel cold and wet against my skin. The river was very loud nearby. It was loud enough to cover up almost every other sound in the woods. I shouted the name of the hiker over and over again. My voice hit the hills and came back to me, but nothing answered me except for the sound of the water. The trail went along the side of the river. The roots of the trees were twisted across the path like traps for your feet. My plastic shoes made a squishing sound in the mud. My toes were very cold and felt numb. I stopped at a turn in the path to rest and breathe. That was when I heard a voice. A man's voice said, "Help me. I've broken my leg." The voice was very clear. The person sounded like they were in a lot of trouble. But the voice came from 2 different places at the exact same time. One voice came from high up on the hill. It sounded far away, but it was clear. The other voice came from down by the river. It was close enough that it felt like someone was right there. Both voices said the exact same words. They expressed the same pain. They both stopped to breathe at the exact same time. I stopped moving and stood very still. My heart began to beat very fast. At first, I thought that maybe it was just an echo. I thought maybe the river was making me hear things. But I realized that was not true. The voices were too perfect. They were exactly the same. It was very wrong. I took a step toward the river. I slipped on some wet leaves as I moved. "Help me," both voices called out again. They were exactly the same once more. Then the voices changed. The voice from the hill became high and small. It sounded like a little girl now. She sounded very scared, and she was crying. She said, "Help me, I've broken my leg." But the voice from the river stayed like a man's voice. It sounded deep and like it was in pain. I stopped moving again. It felt like something was testing me. It was changing its sound to see which voice would make me come closer. The girl's voice made me feel a very strong emotion in my chest. But the timing of the two voices was still perfect. They were saying the words together. It was like they were practicing. I put my hand on my radio. My mouth felt very dry. The voices were now talking at the same time. I heard the man and the child. They used the same words and the same rhythm. I pressed the button on my radio. I said, "This is Jeb. I'm hearing people calling for help from two places at once. Something is very wrong. I need the rest of the team to come here now." The radio made a static sound. Then a person told me they were coming to help. I leaned against a tree and watched the hill and the river. The calling continued, but the voices changed again. Now, a rough voice of an old woman came from the water. A child's small voice came from the hill above me. Whatever it was trying different sounds. It was learning how to sound like different people. The rain ran down my neck, but I stayed very still. Then the voices stopped completely. Instead of voices, there was a new sound. It was a steady thumping sound. It sounded like someone was hitting a piece of hollow wood. It came from both directions at first. Then the sounds became one sound. The thumping slowly went away into the forest. When the rest of the team arrived about 20 minutes later, the woods were completely silent. I told them everything that had happened. They listened to me and looked at each other. But we searched the area anyway. We searched until it became dark outside. We did not find the hiker. We found no footprints in the mud. There were no signs of anyone being there at all. I have lived almost my entire life walking through these mountains. I lived by using what the land gave me. I also spent a lot of time helping people when they got into trouble. For 12 years, I was a member of a group called Search and Rescue. We were the people who were called when someone was lost, hurt, or stuck in a place where they were not supposed to be. I helped hikers who had broken their legs. I helped hunters who got lost in the thick fog. One time, I even helped carry a man who had been attacked by a bear. I believed that I had seen everything these mountains could show a person. I thought that I was prepared for anything that could happen. But there is one time I was called out to help that I cannot forget. It happened near a river called the Oconaluftee River. This day still causes me to wake up in the middle of the night. I wake up with my heart beating very fast. My back is always wet with cold sweat. If I am being honest, that day is the reason I left the team. I never went back to help again. I do not know how to explain what happened without sounding like I am crazy, but that experience stayed deep inside me like something that has gone bad. It has been about 15 years since that day. However, when the wind blows through the trees or when it rains very hard, I hear those sounds again in my head. It makes me wonder what actually lives in these woods. In these woods, the silence feels very heavy. No one is close enough to hear you if you scream for help. That entire week, it did nothing but rain. It rained day after day. The rain turned the dirt roads into thick mud. It turned small creeks into very fast and dangerous rivers. The Oconaluftee River was very high and looked very angry. The brown water was hitting the rocks very hard. It was tearing at the sides of the river as if it wanted to escape. We received a call about a hiker who was missing. I think his name was Mark. He was a person from a big city. People like him often come to the mountains to see waterfalls or to find a quiet place. Someone saw him for the last time near the trail by the river. We all thought that he probably slipped on the wet rocks and got hurt. I was at my small cabin when the radio started making noise. It made a static sound like the noise of many insects. Then the person who sends the messages began to speak. My good boots were still wet from the day before. They were sitting near the wood stove to dry. They were covered in thick mud. The mud was dry and was falling off in small pieces. Because my boots were wet, I put on my old plastic shoes called Crocs. They were not pretty shoes, and they were still muddy from working in the yard, but they were good at gripping the ground when it was slippery. I grabbed my bag that had bandages, tools for broken bones, and lights. I clipped my radio to my belt. I drove to the start of the trail. My truck tires were spinning in the deep mud. There is no cell phone service in that area. There has never been any service there. The closest neighbor lives 4 miles away. He is an old man who has dogs and stays by himself. As soon as you walk into the woods, the trees feel like they are surrounding you. Their branches meet at the top like a roof. The world becomes very quiet. It is too quiet. It feels like the forest is holding its breath and waiting for something to happen. I started walking into the woods alone at first. I wanted to look around while the rest of the team gathered together. The rain soaked through my jacket. It made my shirt feel cold and wet against my skin. The river was very loud nearby. It was loud enough to cover up almost every other sound in the woods. I shouted the name of the hiker over and over again. My voice hit the hills and came back to me, but nothing answered me except for the sound of the water. The trail went along the side of the river. The roots of the trees were twisted across the path like traps for your feet. My plastic shoes made a squishing sound in the mud. My toes were very cold and felt numb. I stopped at a turn in the path to rest and breathe. That was when I heard a voice. A man's voice said, "Help me. I've broken my leg." The voice was very clear. The person sounded like they were in a lot of trouble, but the voice came from 2 different places at the exact same time. One voice came from high up on the hill. It sounded far away, but it was clear. The other voice came from down by the river. It was close enough that it felt like someone was right there. Both voices said the exact same words. They expressed the same pain. They both stopped to breathe at the exact same time. I stopped moving and stood very still. My heart began to beat very fast. At first, I thought that maybe it was just an echo. I thought maybe the river was making me hear things. But I realized that was not true. The voices were too perfect. They were exactly the same. It was very wrong. I took a step toward the river. I slipped on some wet leaves as I moved. "Help me," both voices called out again. They were exactly the same once more. Then the voices changed. The voice from the hill became high and small. It sounded like a little girl now. She sounded very scared and she was crying. She said, "Help me, I've broken my leg." But the voice from the river stayed like a man's voice. It sounded deep and like it was in pain. I stopped moving again. It felt like something was testing me. It was changing its sound to see which voice would make me come closer. The girl's voice made me feel a very strong emotion in my chest. But the timing of the 2 voices was still perfect. They were saying the words together. It was like they were practicing. I put my hand on my radio. My mouth felt very dry. The voices were now talking at the same time. I heard the man and the child. They used the same words and the same rhythm. I pressed the button on my radio. I said, "This is Jeb. I'm hearing people calling for help from 2 places at once. Something is very wrong. I need the rest of the team to come here now." The radio made a static sound. Then a person told me they were coming to help. I leaned against a tree and watched the hill and the river. The calling continued, but the voices changed again. Now, a rough voice of an old woman came from the water. A child's small voice came from the hill above me. Whatever it was trying different sounds. It was learning how to sound like different people. The rain ran down my neck, but I stayed very still. Then the voices stopped completely. Instead of voices, there was a new sound. It was a steady thumping sound. It sounded like someone was hitting a piece of hollow wood. It came from both directions at first. Then the sounds became one sound. The thumping slowly went away into the forest. When the rest of the team arrived about 20 minutes later, the woods were completely silent. I told them everything that had happened. They listened to me and looked at each other. But we searched the area anyway. We searched until it became dark outside. We did not find the hiker. We found no footprints in the mud. There were no signs of anyone being there at all. Story 11. I punched the clock at the local mill until it finally shut down for good back in 2015. The work was bone-tiring, but it was honest. It kept a roof over my head and kept my mind busy enough to stay sane. But 2012, that was a dark year. My divorce was still a raw wound. My wife had left me high and dry, and I spent most of my time muttering to myself about the absolute mess of my life. To clear my head, I'd take to the trails after my shift. I went on solo hikes in the deep backwoods where the silence is so heavy it feels like it could swallow you whole. But there is one night that still jolts me awake in a cold sweat. Even now, my ears strain for sounds that just don't belong. To be honest, it's why I don't wander far after dark anymore. I stay close to the cabin with the lights burning low. That wrongness stays with me, like the mountains themselves have ears tuned just a little too fine. My shift ran long that day. The saws were whining until my ears rang, and sawdust coated my throat like grit in a dry well. I got home to an empty house, the walls feeling like they were closing in because she wasn't there. I grabbed my old canvas pack, the straps frayed from years of use, and tossed in a half-eaten sleeve of cheap cheese crackers. I lit my Coleman lantern, pumping the handle until the mantle hissed to life with an unsteady yellow glow. I headed out back. The trail started right in my yard, a narrow, muddy rut cutting through thick pines that crowded together like somber relatives at a funeral. There were no stars that night. The sky was completely clouded over. Soon, a thick fog began seeping up from the creeks. It started slow but built up fast. These woods aren't forgiving. There is no cell service once you leave the gravel road. The signal dies as quickly as a snuffed candle. My nearest neighbors were the Harlan clan, 2 miles away through thick briars and ridges. You can only hear their hounds baying if the wind is blowing just right. The trees pressed in close, their branches knitting together overhead, muffling my steps until I was alone with nothing but the sound of my own breathing. I trudged on, the lantern swinging from my pack strap. Its beam sliced through the growing mist, making shadows jump like startled animals. The fog rolled in properly then, cold, damp, and thick. It wrapped around my legs and climbed higher until the path ahead was a total blur. I nibbled on those crackers just to pass the time, a cheesy dust dry on my tongue. The crunch sounded incredibly loud in the hush of the woods. Then, a name floated out of the dark. It was faint at first. Jim. Jim. It drifted from somewhere deep off in the pines. I stopped dead in my tracks. I wondered if the wind was fooling me, or if some other fool was lost out here. I hollered back, "That you? Who's there?" The echo came back immediately. "That you? Who's there?" It was my voice. It was my drawl, but it was lagged oddly, like a tape recording being played back just a second too slow. I kept walking. my heart starting to race. A cough built up in my chest, that rough, wet cough I got from breathing mill dust all day. I let it out, a hard hack. The sound came back from the trees identical to mine, a phlegmy, wet hack for hack. A chill ran down my spine. I shouted louder, "Cut the crap! This ain't funny." The reply came back instantly, "Cut the crap! This ain't funny." The mimicry was spot on now, and the delay was shrinking. The fog thickened even more, and the lantern light just bounced back off the white mist like a wall of milk. Then the whispers started. They were close, like breath on the back of my neck. "She took the truck, left me broke," the voice muttered. Damn bills stacking. These were the private gripes I had muttered to myself alone at the mill. I had said them to no one but the machines. No living soul knew those words. No one was near me. Then I saw the shapes flickering in the gray light. They were vague outlines, man-shaped, but their joints seemed to fold backward. Their walk was hitched and wrong. I backed up deliberately, my pulse thundering in my ears. The voice began looping my own hollers, with those private whispers threaded through them. The lag was gone now. It sounded like the thing was standing right beside me. My boot snagged on a root. I tumbled hard. Mud smeared my hands as I scrambled back up and began to bolt blindly through the dark. The voice dogged me, a terrifying blend of my own calls and coughs. It only began to fade as I reached the gravel road. I saw my truck looming in the dark and fumbled with the keys to hit the ignition. The engine growled to life, and my tires chewed gravel as I sped away. I watched the fog recede in the rearview mirror. Once home, I slammed the cabin door and threw the bolt. I stoked the stove high, but the shivers wouldn't leave me. In those moments, that solitude bites deep. There is no signal to call for help and no neighbor within shouting distance. The trees stay mute, hoarding their secrets. But let me tell you about that old Coleman lantern. It's the plain, simple gear that steadies a man when the ground shifts under his feet. It's a hefty thing, with a metal frame dented from years of knocking against trees and green paint flaking where rust has started to nibble. You fill the tank with white gas from a jug, and the smell burns your nose sharp as turpentine. You pump the plunger 20 times until the pressure hisses, then strike a match to the mantle, that fragile mesh sock that glows bright white but turns to black char if you mess up. The flame knob is stiff, and the brass is worn slick from my fingers. When you swing it by the handle, it creaks rhythmically, a high squeak on the way up, a low groan on the way down. It's a boring relic, really. No batteries, just the sound of fuel sloshing inside. But after that night, I would sit by the stove just twisting the knob to hear that steady hiss. It was real. It was dependable. It didn't have lagging echoes or bent shapes. The base gets scorching hot. It'll send you if you touch it. It's my anchor. There's no deceit in that glow, just utility. Weeks blurred together after that. I tried to tell myself it was just exhaustion or a trick of the mist. I even went back to the trail during the daylight, a path I know as well as my own palm. But the echoes felt off. My footsteps sounded too resonant, as if the woods were remembering the sound of me. I left quickly. The dreams started then. I'd dream of the fog smothering me, of a voice stealing my words, and of those contorted forms drawing near. I'd wake up shouting, my bedsheets knotted in my hands. I don't know how to explain it. It was like something was eavesdropping with a keen ear, snatching snippets of my life just to fling them back at me warped, like bait or a taunt. I tried to tell a friend at the mill over a cup of coffee. He laughed and said the solitude was just messing with my head, but his eyes wavered. It looked like my story was echoing something he had seen himself. He didn't ask anything else, and I didn't offer. The mill was padlocked in 2015, and my job evaporated. Now I do odd jobs, mending barns or wiring fences for the folks in the hollows. The solitude gnaws at me even more now that I don't have a routine. My cabin feels empty. My kids don't call, and my ex-wife is living in the city. The trees frame my windows, and the hush of the woods bears down on me every single night. On misty dusks, I still hear my name wafting on the breeze. I check my latches and stay on guard. There is something wrong in those pines. I avoid walking at night now, but the memory always comes back. I lie there and replay the circuit. The long shift, the silence of the house, the walk into the vapor, the first time I heard my name, the cough that came back identical, the whispers of my own secrets, the shapes with the backward joints, the frantic run for the truck. I am a man of the mountains, and I know that these woods are cognizant. They are watching. They are waiting. I hear the Jim, Jim, and the wind, and I know the mimic is still out there, holding onto my voice, waiting for me to step back into the fog. Story 12. I've scraped by on whatever work came my way, first at the auto parts store until they shuttered the windows, then taking on odd jobs here and there. Life has a way of wearing a man down slowly, much like water carving a path through solid rock. Back in 2008, I reckon things were particularly rough. I'd lost my job, the bills were piling up like a winter snowdrift, and the nights felt endless with nothing but my own dark thoughts rattling around my head. My buddy Earl, the type of man who always thinks a change of scenery is a cure-all, dragged me out for a night trek. We headed into those forgotten hollows deep in the backcountry. He told me it would clear my head and shake off the nerves. I wasn't keen on the idea, but I went along anyway. I packed my beat-up stainless steel thermos of instant coffee, the kind that always leaked a drop or two into the glove compartment of my old Ford, staining the fabric a permanent, muddy brown. We drove out as dusk fell, eventually parking at the edge of an old, overgrown logging road. We stepped out with flashlights in hand, the air already crisp with that sharp, biting autumn chill. The hike started out easy enough. The trail wound through groves of pine and oak, and the ground was soft under our boots from a recent rain. There is no cell service out there, not even a whisper of a bar. You'd have to hike miles back to the main road just to see a signal. Our nearest neighbor was old Miss Grady, who lived 3 miles down a dirt track. Her place was tucked so far into the trees you wouldn't even know it was there unless you were looking for it. The woods close in quickly in the dark. The branches reach out like skeletal fingers, and a heavy silence settles over everything, broken only by our footsteps and the occasional lonely hoot of an owl. Earl chattered on about work and women, trying his best to lift the mood, but I stayed quiet. I sipped that bitter coffee from a thermos lid, letting the heat cut through the damp cold. Eventually, we split up for a moment when nature called. I veered off toward a small stream a little ways off, the water gurgling softly under the moonlight that slipped through the canopy. I figured it would be a quick detour, just me and the quiet of the creek. That's when I spotted it. It was draped over a flat rock right by the bank, looking for all the world like a piece of laundry left out to dry. It looked like fur, or perhaps skin. It was supple and fresh-looking, with patches of hair that seemed far too human, coarse and dark in spots. It wasn't a deer hide. It was too smooth in some places, and it stank of wet leather mixed with something metallic, like the smell of blood gone sour. I was a curious fool, so I poked it with a stick. It twitched. The edges of the skin curled inward, like nerves firing in a body that was still alive. It froze me right there, stick in hand. My heart slammed against my ribs. Then I heard a rustling upstream, the sound of branches snapping softly. I looked up. A figure was stepping out of the darkness, silhouetted against the pale moon glow. It looked just like Earl, same height, same flannel shirt. It called my name. "Hey, you done yet?" The voice cracked oddly, like a record skipping a beat. It stepped closer, and my flashlight beam caught its eyes. They were reflective, glowing with a bright, predatory shine like a cat caught in headlights. The thing walked with a lopsided gait, its boots dragging unevenly in the dirt. Then I noticed the skin at its neck. It sagged and hung loose, like a collar that didn't fit right. Everything about it was wrong. I bolted. I didn't think. I just ran. I yelled for the real Earl, my own voice cracking with terror. The trail became a blur as branches whipped across my face. I finally ran into the real Earl, who was panicked, asking me what the hell was going on. We ran together then, our flashlights jerking wildly. Behind us, I could hear soft, heavy steps. Whatever was following us was shedding bits of itself. I could hear the wet thwack of flaps of skin hitting the ground. We made it to the truck, the engine roaring to life after a terrifying second of hesitation. We tore out of there, tires chewing the gravel, and I didn't look back once. That was nearly 18 years ago, but the memory doesn't fade. My cabin feels smaller now, and the isolation bites harder than it used to. I have no reliable phone and no neighbors nearby. The trees outside press against the glass, their silence feeling like a mockery. I sat up all that night with my thermos still half full on the table, the coffee gone stone cold. The wrongness of that night clung to me, smelling like the metallic stink of that pelt. Earl and I didn't talk much after that. He moved on and got a job in town. Me, I stayed here, just rattling around. But let me tell you about that thermos, because it's the little, dull things that ground you when the world feels like it's tilted off its axis. It's an old stainless steel bottle, dented from being dropped in the truck bed, its lid scratched from rolling around the glove box. I fill it with boiling water and instant grounds, the cheap kind that clumps into little balls if you don't stir it fast enough. The smell is bitter and almost burnt, with a sharp tang that hits the back of your throat. The lid always weeps a little bit, even when it's screwed tight. The coffee seeps out and stains whatever it touches, leaving brown spots on the fabric of my truck that look like old blood. The plastic handle is cracked from years of cold snaps, and when I grip it, it leaves deep ridges in my palm. When I pour a cup, it's scalding hot at first, enough to burn your lips if you're careless. Then it cools down into a lukewarm sludge with the grounds settling at the bottom. It's a boring habit, brewing it every morning, stirring it with a spoon that clinks against the metal sides. There are no fancy flavors here, it's just black and strong. But after that night in the woods, I've learned to appreciate it. I unscrew that lid slowly, inhale the steam, and watch it curl into the air. It is real. It is familiar. It doesn't twitch, and its skin doesn't sag. The threads of the cap grind a little when I tighten them, metal on metal. I've washed it 1,000 times, but the dark rings on the inside linger, a patina of years of use. It keeps things warm for a few hours, even though the insulation is fading. It grounds me. It's a predictable warmth when that memory chills me to the bone. In the days that followed, I tried to forget. I even went back to that stream once during the broad daylight. I found nothing, no pelt, no tracks, no sign of a struggle. But the water gurgled wrong. It was either too loud or too soft, and I couldn't tell which. I left quickly and never went back. The dreams started soon after. I'd see that pelt twitching on the rock. I'd see the figure calling my name with a voice that wasn't quite right, its skin slipping off its frame. Even now, I wake up and immediately check the mirror. I poke at the skin on my neck, making sure it's tight, making sure it's mine. I don't know how to explain what I saw. It was like something had discarded an old covering and tried on a new one that didn't quite fit. I told a buddy at a bar about it once. He just laughed and said they were nothing but moonshine tales. But I saw his eyes shift. He looked away too fast. The years roll on. The loss of my old job is a distant memory, but that night is as sharp as a razor. Seclusion is a curse. With no signal and no visitors, the trees have become my silent judges. On rainy nights, I hear a rustling outside my window. I peek out, but there is nothing but the void. Yet, the doubt remains. I remember it all too clearly, the track that was Earl's idea. My reluctant yes, the coffee leaking in the Ford, the dark trail, the moment we split up, the gurgling stream, finding that supple, stinking hide, the jab of the stick, the twitch of life, the snap of a branch, the figure emerging with Earl's face, the gleam in its eyes, the breaking voice, the sagging neck, the flight through the thorns, the wet slaps of falling skin behind us, the sanctuary of the truck. I am an old man now, and I tire easily, but the memory stays vivid. It keeps me awake. I listen to the night. Was that a rustle? Is it the wind, or is it something else? If I'm being honest, I dread the mirror, but I look anyway. I always look. I still dream of the skin peeling. I wake up and feel my own neck, relieved to find it smooth and firm. Yet, the wrongness lingers deep inside. I'm rambling, I know. I'm tired. This story is mine to carry alone. The mountains know what happened. I endure, but that rustle never truly fades. Whatever shed its skin that night is still out there, waiting in the hollows. Story 13. I've been hunkered down in these Appalachian ridges for most of my days, scraping by on whatever work I could find, welding pipes, fixing trucks, and doing the hard labor the mountains demand. But by 2015, things had gone sour. I lost my steady gig at the local garage, and my trailer started feeling like a cage. I spent my nights with nothing but the flickering light of TV reruns to keep me company in the dark. The nights stretched long, and my mind wouldn't stop chewing on regrets, much like a dog gnawing on an old bone. If I'm being honest, I was trying to kick the smokes back then, too. My pockets were always stuffed with those cheap menthol cough drops, the kind you buy at the dollar store that burn your tongue but give your hand something to do. A buddy suggested I get out of the house, but I figured a solo hike through the misty ridges would do the trick better. I wanted to clear my head, or so I thought. I packed light, a sleeping bag, a bit of jerky, and a flashlight with fresh batteries. I drove my old pickup to the trailhead as dusk settled, the engine rattling and complaining as if it knew better than to go up there. The path wound up through the thick pines, and a low fog started creeping in from the creeks, turning the world into a soft, blurry gray. There was no cell service out there. There hadn't been for miles. You'd have to trek all the way back to the highway just to see a single bar on your phone. My nearest neighbor was Old Man Harlan, for miles away as the crow flies, but it was double that distance on foot through the thick tangles of the brush. The trees crowded in close, and their silence was thick. It felt like they were listening to me, but had nothing to say in return. My boots crunched through the fallen leaves, the only sound in the woods besides my own breath puffing out in the chill air. I found a small clearing as night fell properly. There was a ring of stones for a fire pit already there, left behind by hikers from years past. I built a low fire, the flames crackling softly as the wood smoke curled up into the dark. I sat on a fallen log and unwrapped a cough drop. The menthol was sharp in my nose, and I rolled it around on my tongue to chase away the craving for a cigarette. The fire eventually died down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows against the trees. That's when I heard the rustling. It came from the pitch-black woods. A figure stepped into the dim light. He was tall and lanky, wearing ragged clothes that looked like an old miner's get-up. His face was half hidden under the brim of a wide hat, pulled low over his eyes. He didn't say a word at first. He just sat down across the fire from me, uninvited, and stared deep into the coals. My heart started ticking up in my chest, but I gave him a polite nod. "Evening," I said. He grunted, his voice low and gravelly. He started talking about the trails, naming specific spots I'd hiked when I was just a kid. The bend in the creek where the trout run thick, and the ridge overlooked with a drop-off that makes your stomach flip. The strange thing was, his stories matched mine perfectly. It was like he'd heard them before, or like he was pulling them right out of my head. I glanced at his hands, which were folded in his lap. His fingers were far too long, his knuckles knobby and swollen. His nails were chipped and black, as if coal dust had been ground into them for a lifetime. Then he laughed, a dry, rasping sound that didn't fit his large frame. It sounded like the wind blowing through dead, brittle leaves. I offered him a cough drop, my hand shaking just a little as I held it out. "Want one?" I asked. He took it slowly. He popped it into his mouth and chewed it deliberately, his eyes glazing over as if he were looking at something far away. As the night wore on, he began to shift in his seat. His body twisted in subtle, unnatural ways. I could hear his joints popping quietly under his skin, as if they were being rearranged. It was completely wrong. I realized then that I wasn't safe. I pretended to doze off, keeping my eyes slitted so I could watch him. I peeked through my lashes, and suddenly he was gone. I sat up quickly and checked my gear. My pack had been rifled through, my jerky was missing, and my flashlight had been moved. I looked at the dirt around the fire pit and saw footprints. They started as human boot prints, but as they led away into the dark, they shifted. They became paw prints, with long claws dug deep into the earth. I didn't wait for the sun to fully rise. As soon as the gray light of dawn broke, I bolted. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck. That stranger knew too much. Everything about him felt like a violation of the natural world. In the night since then, sleep has been hard to find. My cabin feels empty, and the isolation presses in on me. I have no signal to call my kin, and no neighbors ever drop by. The trees outside whisper when the wind blows, or at least, that's what I tell myself. I poured a cup of coffee the next morning, my hands still shaky from the adrenaline. But let me tell you about those cough drops, because it's the ordinary junk store stuff that reminds a man he's still planted firmly on the ground after something tries to uproot him. They come in a crinkly foil packs, the kind you buy in bulk at the dollar store. The labels are usually faded from being rubbed in your pocket all day. When you tear one open, the smell hits you. Menthol as sharp as pine sap, mixed with a fake cherry scent that's far too sweet. It clings to your fingers and makes them sticky. You pop one in your mouth, and it's hard at first, the edges feeling rough against your teeth. Then it softens as you suck on it, burning a cool path down your throat. Eventually, the flavor fades until it tastes like nothing but wax, leaving your breath minty but your tongue numb. It's a boring habit, chewing them to stay off the smokes, the pack rattling in my pocket with every step I take. There's no kick like tobacco, just filler to keep idle hands from reaching for a light. But after that night, I'd unwrap them very deliberately. I'd feel the foil crinkle and taste the burn. It was real. It was simple. It didn't glaze over, and it didn't shift its shape. The silver wrappers pile up in my trash like curling scraps of metal. I've sucked on hundreds of them since then, the flavor never changing, pack after pack. That routine tang grounds me. It's predictable, and that's what I need when I know that wrongness is lurking out there in the dark. I tried to forget it at first. I even went back to that clearing a few weeks later in the bright daylight to chase away the shadows. I found nothing, no prints, no signs of the stranger, nothing. But the air there hung heavy, and the trees were far too quiet. I left feeling more uneasy than when I arrived. Now, the dreams creep in. I see the stranger sitting there, his fingers stretching longer and longer, his laugh rasping in the air. I wake up checking my own skin, feeling my own bones to make sure they haven't changed. I don't know how to explain it. It was like he was wearing a suit that didn't fit, like he was shedding an old life to step into a new one. I told my buddy Earl about it over a beer. He just shrugged and said it was nothing but hiker tall tales. But his eyes were doubtful. He looked like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. The years have stacked up since then. My trailer is the same, but I'm much wearier. The loneliness bites. There's no ping from a phone, and no visitors unless they trek a mile from the road. The trees stand like silent sentinels, and the hush of the woods is crushing. On stormy evenings, I hear a rustling out beyond the window panes. I peek out, but there is only a void, and yet I wonder. I remember that night perfectly. The mist on the path, the low fire, the unbidden guest. I remember the way he spoke my own life back to me, the way his knuckles looked like coal, and the way the human footprints turned into something with claws. I am an old man now, and the fatigue sets in quickly, but the memory is lucid. I maintain my vigil. I listen to the darkness. Was that a crackle of a twig? I feel the trepidation in my chest. If I'm honest, I'm terrified of what I might see in the looking glass. I gaze at my reflection, watching for any sign of a dream where the skin undulates and the frame shifts. I feel my own neck, relieved to find it silken and real, but the wrongness endures. It's a profound part of the Appalachia I know. I carry the story alone, knowing the peaks are aware of what stays hidden in the hollows. The crackle in the woods never truly dissipates. The sloughing of skin is just waiting to happen again, out there, yonder in the fog. Story 14. My bones ache from all those years hauling logs at the mill, and my mind tends to wander back to things I'd rather forget. But if you're asking about that night up on the ridge, I suppose I owe it to myself to finally say it out loud. It was back in 1999, just as hunting season was creeping up. I was younger then, strong enough to work a full day at the lumberyard without falling over. I lived in one of those hollows near the West Virginia line, where the hills fold in on themselves like crumpled paper. My nearest neighbor was Old Man Harlan, about 3 miles down the dirt road, and that was only if the creek hadn't flooded from the rain. We didn't have cell phones out there back then. We just had a landline that buzzed like angry bees whenever a storm was coming. Isolation like that gets into your blood. It makes you think you're alone, but sometimes you aren't. That day had been a scorcher. I worked from dawn until the whistle blew, stacking pine boards until my shoulders burned. My shirt was soaked with sweat, and by the time I quit, I had to wring out the red bandana around my neck every hour. I smelled like the woods, sharp pine sap mixed with the scent of hard labor. When I got home, the cabin was quiet. My wife was gone by then, God rest her soul, and it was just me and my dog Buster, who was getting old himself. I fixed supper on the wood stove. I fried up some potatoes and onions in the cast iron skillet that has been in my family since my grandfather's time. Now, that skillet has a history of its own. Over the years, the grease builds up. It's not fresh grease, it's old, soaked into the iron like memories you can't scrub out. It has a heavy, smoky scent that can turn a bit rancid if you don't season it right. I'd heat it up slowly and watch the oil bubble and pop, filling the kitchen with a thick, clinging aroma that sticks to your clothes and hair. The handle is worn smooth from generations of hands, with little pits in the metal where it has corroded over time. The weight of it is immense, like lifting a piece of the mountain itself. I'd scrape the bottom with a metal spatula, and the gritty rasp would dig into the crusty bits left over from last week's meals. Slices of onion and potato would sizzle and crackle, sending up an oily vapor that coats the inside of your nose. If you aren't careful, it splatters and leaves tiny, stinging burns on your arms. After eating, I'd wash it by hand with nothing but hot water and a rag. The surface stayed slick, never truly clean. That skillet reminds you that life is found in the small, greasy details. After supper, Buster was snoring by the stove, and I felt the itch to get out. Hunting season was coming, and I needed to scout some deer trails on the high ridge. I figured a night walk would clear my head. The moon was full and bright enough to light the path without a flashlight. I grabbed my jacket, stuffed my bandana in my pocket, and headed out. The screen door banged shut behind me with its familiar rhythm, a high whine on the pole and a low groan as it settled. I stepped off the porch into the tall grass. The air had cooled, but it still carried the day's heat and the dampness of the creek. The pine and oak trees swallowed all sound. There was no wind, just a heavy quiet that pressed against my ears. You could holler, and the echo would come back faint, as if the mountains were mocking you. I started up the narrow trail I had worn into the earth over the years. My boots crunched on fallen leaves, which was the only sound besides my own breathing. I climbed for about an hour until I reached the top where the ridge levels out. The moonlight painted everything in silver and gray. I was looking for deer signs, scrapes on the bark, or fresh droppings. I stopped to listen, but it was dead silent. No owls, no foxes. That should have been a warning, but I was tired and focused on the hunt. Then I saw it. It was just a shadow at first, a tall, man-like outline off to my left on a parallel ridge about 50 yards away. My own shadow was jagged on the ground in front of me, but this other shadow was following me, keeping a perfect, silent pace. I stopped to catch my breath, and it stopped too. I figured it was a trick of the light, so I rubbed my eyes hard. When I moved, it moved. My heart started to race. I took a deliberate step, and it mirrored me exactly. The ground over there was rocky, so the shadow should have wavered, but it stayed straight and steady. It felt like looking in a warped mirror. I waved my arm slowly, and it did the same. I laughed at myself, thinking I was being a fool and that it was just a shadow from a boulder. But then it stretched. Its limbs grew longer in an unnaturally slow way, like pulling taffy. The arms reached up too high, and the fingers spread out thin like twigs. Then the whole thing twisted and dropped suddenly onto all fours. It looked like a beast, but it was wrong. Its legs bent backward like a dog's, but they were much longer, with joints popping out in places they shouldn't. There was no sound at all, just a visual shift that made my eyes hurt. I pressed my bandana to my face and inhaled the pine smell to ground myself. When I lowered the cloth, the thing was closer. Its edges were blurring like heat rising off a summer road, even though the night was cold. I froze. It stood up again and mimicked my stance exactly. Then it tilted its head way too far, like a neck cracking in slow motion. A heavy dread sat on my chest. My breathing got shallow. The silence was the worst part. No crickets, no rustling leaves. I was miles from help, and no one would hear me if I screamed. I began to back up slowly. It followed me, sliding along the edge of the ridge. It didn't walk, it glided, its shadow bleeding into the darkness. I tripped on a rock and fell hard on my knee. I didn't cry out, even though it hurt. I scrambled back, my hands scraping the dirt. The thing stopped at the tree lean and melted away like ink in water. It was gone. I sat there panting for what felt like hours. Everything looked wrong now. The shadows of the branches seemed to twitch. I limped back down the trail, jumping at every snapping twig. I made it home before dawn and bolted the door. Buster whined as if he could smell the fear on me. I haven't gone back up to that ridge since. To be honest, I don't trust shadows anymore. Out here. I should have turned back sooner. After that night, I tried to shake it off and go back to work, but shadows started bothering me. In the barn, they would flicker, and in bed, I'd watch the moonlight shadows on the wall, swearing they moved when I blinked. I told old man Harlan about it. He laughed it off as mountain tricks, but his eyes didn't look like he was joking. Hunting season came and went without me. I stayed on the lower trails near home, but the memory sticks to me like a burr on a sock. It wasn't a creature, exactly. It was a shadow gone wrong. It makes you question what is real in the quiet places of the world. Years have passed. The cabin creaks more now, and Buster is long gone. I sit alone and listen to the screen door hinges, and I wonder if that thing is still up there waiting. Shadows stretch longer as you get older, and in the silence, they move freely. I've tried to forget, but I can't. I still have dreams of those stretching limbs and that tilting head. I wake up sweating, thinking about the smell of pine and wrongness. I avoid the full moon now. I stay inside and bolt the door. The ridge calls to me sometimes, but I don't answer. It isn't worth it. It haunts me how it simply melted away at the end. In these hills, things bend the wrong way. There is no cell service and no neighbors. It's just you and the dark. I'm telling you this so the story doesn't die with me. Keep an eye on your shadow, friend. It might be watching you back. My coffee is cold now, and the day is wasting away. Just remember, out there in the quiet, a certain kind of wrongness hides in plain sight. That night changed me. I used to think shadows were just a lack of light. Now, I know they are something waiting to shift. Even in the daylight, I scan the ground and the walls. My nephew from the city laughed when I told him, but he doesn't know the weight of the silence. Winters are the hardest. The snow makes the moonlight reflect bright, and the shadows look as sharp as knives. One time, years later, I thought I saw it again by the creek. It turned out to be just a tree, but my heart raced just as fast as it did in 1999. These mountains hold secrets as deep as coal seams. It doesn't matter what it was, a ghost or a trick of the mind. It happened, and I haven't slept soundly since. If you ever venture up onto the ridges at night, watch the shadows that walk beside you. If one of them mirrors you too closely, turn back. Don't wait for it to stretch. That is my testimony. Out here, the wrongness is real, and it follows you. Story 15. It has been nearly 9 years since that night in 2017, but some things stick to you like thick mud on your boots after a heavy rain. Back then, I was living in a cramped little apartment in one of those tiny towns tucked deep into the West Virginia hills. It wasn't much to look at, just a single room with a kitchenette and a bed that sagged right in the middle. I worked odd jobs, mostly fixing fences or hauling firewood for folks nearby. That summer was stifling. The air was thick, heavy, and completely still. I didn't have central air, just a single fan that whirred lazily in the corner. But the worst part was the refrigerator. That old beast hummed constantly, sounding like a hive of angry bees trapped inside the metal. It would start as a low buzz, then kick up into a higher whine whenever the compressor cycled on. I could hear it through the thin walls, and it vibrated the floorboards just enough for me to feel it in my feet. I'd lie awake some nights, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, counting the rhythm, hum hum hum, a short pause, and then it would start all over again. The door seal was rotten, letting out a faint chill that smelled of stale milk and forgotten leftovers. Inside, the shelves were warped with age, and the bottles would clink softly whenever the machine shook. I'd wipe down the sticky spills with a rag every now and then, but that hum never quit. It made the whole apartment feel alive in a bad way, as if the room itself were breathing. That sound got under my skin, especially late at night when the rest of the world went quiet. It pushed me to get out, to seek the woods where I thought silence ruled. To be honest, that fridge is the reason I headed out that evening. I wanted to escape that endless drone. I grabbed my wrinkled map from the glove box of my old Ford. That truck was a relic, with rust eating through the fenders, but it got me around the hollows well enough. The map was faded, its creases worn white from being folded so many times, and it was covered in pencil scratches from my past hikes. I stuffed it into my pack along with a water bottle and a flashlight, even though the moon was nearly full. I stepped out into the humid night, and the screen door slapped shut behind me. There was no one around. The building only had 4 units, and we all kept to ourselves. My neighbor downstairs was as deaf as a post, so he wouldn't have heard me leave anyway. I drove out to the trailhead, about 10 miles up a gravel road that twisted through the hills like a snake. I parked the truck and started walking. There is no cell service out there, and there hasn't been for years. The signal drops the second you leave the main road. It's just you and the trees, pressing in close from every side. The underbrush was thick that night. Laurel bushes and briars snagged at my pants as I pushed through them. The path wasn't much of a trail. It was mostly a deer path, narrow and overgrown. The air hung heavy, with no breeze to stir the leaves, and sweat began to bead quickly on my back. I figured I'd hike for a couple of hours to clear my head and maybe find a spot to sit and watch the stars poke through the forest canopy. The woods out here have a way of swallowing sound. If you holler, the sound comes back muffled, as if the hills are hoarding the noise for themselves. Isolation like that comforts some people, but it scares others. Back then, I thought it was peace. Then, the smell hit me. It came suddenly on a small puff of wind. It smelled like rotten meat, but sharp, with a chemical edge like ammonia that burned my nose. It wasn't the smell of a dead deer or a raccoon. I've smelled plenty of those bloated by the creek after a flood. This was fresh. It felt alive. It seemed to circle me, fading away in one direction, only to grow stronger from another. I stopped dead in my tracks, sniffing the air like a hound. I pushed deeper into the brush, thinking maybe I'd stumbled onto an illegal dump site. But the woods only got thicker, with no sign of trash or man-made waste. The odor grew until my eyes began to water and my stomach churned. I don't know how to explain it, but the smell felt aimed at me. It felt personal. I found a fallen log and sat down to catch my breath. I pulled my shirt up to my nose to sniff the fabric. It just smelled like sweat and laundry soap. But as I sat there, the smell intensified, wrapping around me like thick smoke from a fire. I gagged and spit into the dirt. That's when the whispers started. They were faint at first, riding on that awful scent. The words were in a tongue I didn't recognize, full of guttural clicks and low moans. Even though I couldn't understand the language, the tone felt accusatory, like a finger pointing at me. You, they seemed to say. Your fault. Shapes began to flicker in the corners of my eyes. I saw glints of light, like eyes catching the moonlight. Whenever these shapes drew near, the rotten stink would peak. It felt hot and wet, like someone was breathing right on the back of my neck. I bolted upright, my heart pounding against my ribs. I dropped my map and didn't even stop to grab it. I ran blindly through the brush, branches whipping against my face and thorns tearing at my skin. The odor chased me, shaking uncontrollably. I have never forgotten that mark left on me. I suppose I should have known better than to hike alone so late at night, but the apartment was closing in on me, and the fridge was humming its endless mocking tune. I had been tossing and turning, my sheets sticking to my skin in the summer heat. I just needed to get out. I remembered driving the Ford slowly back home, the headlights cutting through the darkness. I had parked at the edge of the woods where the road peters out into nothing. There were no other cars. Sensible folks don't venture that deep after sundown. I remembered the hike in, how the trail wound gradually up before dipping into a hollow thick with ferns. The moonlight had filtered spotty through the leaves, turning everything a ghostly gray. The crickets had been chirping when I started, but they fell silent the further I went. The memory of that night plays over in my head constantly. I escaped the hum of the fridge only to run into something much worse. Now, I have nightmares where that stench returns in my sleep, marking me all over again. I haven't gone on a hike since that summer. I stick to the paved paths in town now, but the memory still gnaws at me. I tried telling a buddy about it once over coffee at the diner. He just chuckled and said I probably ate some bad mushrooms or breathed in some gas from the mill, but his laugh rang hollow. People around here know that these hills hold odd things. The apartment is gone now. I moved to a cabin even deeper in the woods, ironically. A wood stove heats it now, crackling softly, but the isolation is the same. There's still no signal, and my neighbors are miles away. Some nights, I sit by the window and listen to my new fridge. Hum, hum, hum. It's a better sound than the silence waiting out there in the trees. I never did find that map. I left it crumpled in the dirt, and I wonder if it's still there, weathered and bleached by the sun. Those shapes I saw, they weren't animals. The way their eyes glinted was wrong, and the whispers were too focused, too personal. I ran until my lungs burned, and that clearing saved my life. The shift in the wind was a mercy, but the mark remains. I believe the woods breathe wrong sometimes. Sometimes, a scent carries a dark intent. I ramble about this because it eases the weight a little, but the fear is never truly gone. Heed the wind, friend. In these hollows, the scent is what hunts you. Isolation seals your fate, and there is no escape once you are marked. The hum of a refrigerator is nothing compared to the accusations of the woods. Now, the silence is what terrifies me. I stay inside now, hum it all. My old Ford is scrap, my map is lost, and I am a man marked by a rotten wind. That is my tale. Take it as a warning. Story 16. You know, my old bones do not handle the cold very well anymore. But back in 2005, I was still strong enough to ignore it. That year, I spent my days working on roofs, fixing leaks for people who lived deep in the hollows. It had been raining for many days, turning the dirt roads into thick mud. The work paid just enough to keep my lights on, nothing more. By the time I finished each day, my hands were sore and raw. Blisters formed fast, swelling under the skin because of the cheap leather gloves I wore. Those gloves were nothing special. I bought them from the small hardware store in town for a few dollars. When they were new, they were stiff and uncomfortable. After one season, they softened, but the seams began to crack where the stitching failed. The leather had a strong, worn smell, old sweat mixed with tar from roof shingles. Every morning, I pulled them on and felt the rough inside scrape my palms. Small bits of dirt and grit from the day before stayed trapped in the folds. On hot days, blisters formed quickly. Sometimes they burst, and fluid soaked into the lining, leaving yellow stains. At night, I hung the gloves near the wood stove to dry. I watched thin steam rise as the heat pulled out the dampness. The fingers stayed curled, like they still remembered my grip. The palms were dark with grease from tools. Washing them never helped much. Soap only made the leather stiff again and caused more cracking. Every so often, I rubbed saddle soap into them, slow circles, until the leather looked dull and slightly shiny. Still, the blisters always came back. They popped under pressure, leaving raw skin behind. Those gloves lasted me for years. When holes formed, I patched them with duct tape. Simple things like that kept a man grounded in his work. Without them, the shingles would have torn my hands apart. I still have a pair like them, even though I do not work roofs anymore. That night, after washing the dirt and sweat off my body, I could not relax. The cabin felt too small, like the walls were closing in. Back then, I lived past the creek, where the paved road turned to gravel and then ended. My closest neighbor was Widow Jenkins, about 4 miles away, and she turned her lights off early every night. There was no cell service then. Even now, it barely works. Back then, I only had a landline, and it rang so rarely that the sound felt hollow when it did. Trees surrounded the cabin, standing close and quiet, like they were listening. I thought a walk might ease the pain in my back. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside. The screen door creaked like it always did, a sharp squeak as it opened, then a low groan as it settled shut behind me. The trail started behind the cabin. It was a rocky path that climbed the hill. Leaves crunched under my boots, dry from the daytime sun. The moon hung low in the sky, giving off pale light. There was no wind, only a heavy, pressing silence from the woods. You could walk for hours out there and never see another person. If you shouted, your echo came back weak, swallowed by the pine trees. The first touch was soft. It felt like a hand brushing my arm, cold, wet, gone in an instant. I spun around, my heart jumping hard. Nothing was there, only rocks and shadows. I told myself it was nothing, probably a branch I did not notice. I kept walking, but the cold stayed with me. It spread across my skin like frost creeping in summer. It was not natural. It made the hairs on my arms stand up. I kept going. The path became steeper, loose rocks shifting under my boots. The silence grew heavier. The trees stood still, like guards watching. No animals moved. No squirrels. No owls. I felt completely alone, but watched. It happened again. Something grabbed my wrist. Fingers wrapped tight and pulled slightly. Sharp nails pressed into my skin. I yanked my arm back and swung at the air. Nothing. There were no marks on my skin, but the pain stayed, pulsing deep. I froze where I stood. My breathing sounded too loud in the quiet. "Who's out here?" I called. My voice fell flat. No answer came back. Fear started to build slowly, like sap rising inside a tree. I walked faster. Then the touches came more often. A brush against my shoulder, a grip around my ankle. It felt like something was testing me, learning where I was weak. I ran. The grip stopped only when I reached my truck. I shook the whole drive home. At first, I thought it was just my mind. I was tired from working on roofs all day. My hands throbbed from blisters. But that cold feeling, it knew exactly where to touch. 4 days after, I stayed away from the trail. I only walked during daylight and stayed close to the cabin. But at night, lying awake, I felt phantom touches. On my arm, my leg, the weak places. I told no one. People would have thought I was losing my mind. I cannot explain the wrongness of it. It was not a person. There was nothing to see, only invisible hands, probing and feeling. That winter, the wood stove crackled every night, but the warmth never reached deep enough. Outside, the silence waited. I believe the hills hold things that test you. In quiet places, they learn your shape. It still makes me shiver. That walk started like any other. After supper, beans and cornbread, I paced the porch. My blisters itched under the bandages. The night air felt cool and still. The trail called to me, and I thought it would clear my head. I drove my old truck to the trailhead, about a mile from home. No other vehicles were there. I stepped into the darkness, boots crunching on gravel, then leaves. Crunch, crunch, a steady rhythm. Moonlight lit the path. Rocks shone pale white. The first touch shocked me again. A cold grip on my arm. I spun fast. Nothing. The cold spread through me like ice water in my veins. I rubbed the spot, but felt only my jacket. I kept going, uneasy. The path twisted through boulders. Trees leaned in close. No wind, no sound. Then my wrist was grabbed again, fingers tight, nails biting. I yelled and pulled free. The air was empty. No injury showed, but the sting stayed. Then my ankle, cold hands wrapped around it. I tripped and fell hard, knees slamming into the dirt. Fear crushed down on me. I slapped wildly, cursed aloud. The touches did not stop. My neck, my thigh, tugging, brushing. I wondered if it was copying me, learning me, feeling my shape. I ran without thinking. The truck appeared ahead. The grips vanished. I drove home shaking and locked the door behind me. The nightmares never left. I ramble because it repeats in my head. That night, the work had worn me down. Cheap gloves, blistered hands. But the trail was wrong. The isolation made it worse. No phone signal. No neighbors. Only trees watching. Those touches knew where I hurt. My blistered palms. My taking back. It marked me. Years later, I moved to another cabin. But the memory followed. I do not walk at night anymore. I stay inside, watching the wood stove glow. Still, the feeling comes sometimes. That cold touch. The wrongness stays. I had walked that path since I was a boy. Rocky, steep, familiar. But that night, it was different. Too quiet. First the brush, then the grip. It built slowly. Running saved me. But whatever it was, it knows. I shake now, even telling this. Listen to me. Do not walk alone at night. The hills grab back. In 2005, summer stayed hot. Roofs were slick with sweat. Gloves rubbed my skin raw. I came home restless. I went to the trail. The touches began. Cold. With persistent. Fear grew. I barely escaped. I still feel it. I have not slept right since. The cabin creaks. The stove pops. But the silence outside still calls. Do not answer it. That wrong thing waits. I threw those gloves away eventually, but faint scars stayed on my hands, like the touches. Marks you cannot see. Neighbors were too far away. I told no one. I carried it alone. At night, I lie awake, waiting for the grip. It comes in dreams. Cold fingers. Knowing fingers. I do not know what it was. Not an animal. Just wrong. The hills breathe it. Being alone makes it stronger. There was no help. It tested me. It found my weakness. It still knows. Telling this helps some, but it is not gone. Feel the chill. It grabs. Story 17. When the wind screams through the pine trees, my thoughts drift back to the winter of 2011. That winter, I was staying in the old family cabin. It sat deep in a hollow, far from town, where the creek stayed cold even during summer. Trouble was brewing in the family. My sisters were fighting over Ma's belongings after she passed. Every phone call turned sharp, voices cutting like knives. I could not take it anymore. The cabin felt like it was closing in on me, full of tension and anger. That was when I decided to step outside and walk in the woods to clear my head. I grabbed a handful of salted peanuts from the kitchen counter. Nothing special, just the kind that come in a plastic jar that is always half empty. I stuffed them into my coat pocket and headed out into the night. Snow lightly covered the ground, crunching under my boots. There was no moon, only my flashlight cutting a narrow tunnel through the darkness. I lived far out then. The nearest neighbor was Old Lady Pruitt, about 5 miles down a rough, rutted road. There was no cell service. Back then, we barely even had it in town. Out there, it was just silence. The trees stood tall and still, like guards watching, swallowing every sound I made. That winter, the wood stove at the cabin burned almost all the time. I fed it oak logs, splitting them myself out back with an old maul that had seen better days. The stove was heavy black iron, sitting in the corner like it owned the place. After a few fires, the air filled with a scorched smell, sharp, bitter, and woody. The smell did not fade. It layered over time, char building inside the stove, flaking off when you stirred the ashes. I opened the stove door with a poker, metal scraping against metal with a dull, ugly sound. Sparks jumped out. Heat blasted my face and dried my eyes fast. The logs cracked softly at first, then popped loud as they caught fire. Sometimes smoke leaked into the room if the flue clogged, burning your nose and throat. I swept ashes out every day. The gray powder was fine like flour, sticking to my boots and broom. The damper creaked when I moved it, whining like it was unhappy. That stove kept the cabin warm, but the burnt oak smell soaked into everything. The walls, my clothes, even my hair. I woke up smelling it and went to bed smelling it. It was a simple chore, but it grounded you. It reminded you that winter out there was dangerous. Without that stove, the cold would slip in through every crack and turn everything hard and brittle. Some evenings, I sat by it and warmed my hands, watching the flames lick the logs until they glowed red. That stove had been there for generations. It had dents from when my grandpa once dropped a log on it. Nothing fancy, just steady heat against the cold. That night, I slipped out the back door with my flashlight. The path led downhill to the creek, then climbed into thicker woods. Snowflakes drifted slowly, melting on my face. The peanuts knocked together in my pocket as I walked. The salt stung a small cut on my finger. I planned to walk about a mile, sit by the water, and let the quiet wash the noise of the day out of my head. The trees closed in fast. Branches were heavy with snow. Silence pressed down hard. The only sound was my breathing, white clouds puffing in front of my face. No animals moved at first. I thought it was just the winter hush. After about half an hour, I reached the stream. The water gurgled softly under a thin skin of ice. I sat on a flat rock and pulled out the peanuts. I crunched one slowly. The sound echoed too loudly in the stillness. That is when I noticed the deer. I saw their eyes first, 2 pairs of them, shining from the trees across the creek. They did not blink. They just stared. I waved my arm, expecting them to run. They did not move. Their heads tilted slightly, together at the same time. A chill ran through me, but I brushed it off. Deer can act strange. I ate another peanut. Then the coyotes appeared. They slid out of the brush, quiet and low. Their eyes were fixed on me the same way. They did not howl. They did not rush. They only watched. I waved again and shouted, "Hit!" My voice fell flat and vanished into the trees. They stepped closer. More animals came. Rabbits hopped out near the edge of the clearing. Foxes crept low to the ground. All of them stared. None blinked. Slowly, they began to form a circle around me. Their movements were wrong. They moved together, stepping forward as one, then stopping, like a rehearsed dance. An owl hooted, but the sound was strange. Too steady, too rhythmic. It echoed wrong. Fear rose slowly inside me, like sap freezing in your veins. I ran straight through the circle. Fur brushed my legs. Bodies pressed close, but nothing attacked. No teeth, no claws, just eyes. I made it home shaking. At first, I told myself it was the isolation, that my mind had played tricks on me in the silence. But the eyes stayed with me. They reflected colors wrong, not silver like moonlight, something else, reds, greens, off. 4 days afterward, I stayed inside. I kept the wood stove burning hot. Still, the memory gnawed at me. I told no one. family problems were already bad enough. I do not know how to explain the wrongness of it. Those animals were not themselves. They moved like puppets, like something else was pulling the strings from far away. The cabin felt safer, but the silence outside waited. I believe the hollows sometimes hold things like that. Watching packs, it still keeps me awake. That night replayed in my head for weeks. I avoided family calls. I paced the floor, boards creaking under my weight. The stove dried the air, making my throat sore. I poured peanuts into a bowl but could not eat them. The crunch sounded too loud in my memory. I only went outside to gather wood, and only in daylight. I chopped fast. The trees seemed to lean in then, branches like fingers. There was no phone to call for help. The line was down from the snow anyway. Pruitt was too far to shout to. It was just me and the quiet. The walk had started simple. The door closed behind me, hinges groaning. Snow was fresh on the path, soft under my boots. My flashlight bounced, catching flakes like stars. The creek's sound guided me. I sat by the rock. The peanuts were salty on my tongue. The deer appeared first, still as stone. Coyotes came next. Rabbits and foxes filled the gaps. The circle tightened. Heads tilted together. The owl's call clicked like jaws, matching the sound of peanuts crunching. Eyes shone wrong, red, green, unnatural. They moved closer. I ran. Fur brushed me. I escaped, but I was marked. I talk in circles because it loops in my head. Winter 2011 was bitter cold. Family fighting drove me out. The woods claimed me. The pack watched. Their movements were wrong. They did not scatter. They only observed. I still shake thinking about it. I moved cabins later, but the hollows stayed the same. No service. Neighbors far away. Trees silent and heavy. I do not walk in winter anymore. I stay by the stove, but I still feel eyes on me. Something wrong behind them. I threw away the peanuts. The crunch haunted me, like jaws snapping. Something else was controlling them. Isolation fed it. There were no witnesses. The pack knows. Telling this makes me shiver. Listen carefully. The woods watch. In 2011, snow was heavy. Trouble at home. I went to the creek. Animals gathered. They stared. They tilted their heads. They clicked. They closed in. I ran. It was not right. I have not gone deep since. The cabin creaks. The stove pops. The silence calls. Do not answer it. The wrongness waits. The path was old, worn mostly by deer. That night, it was empty until it was not. The deer led. The others followed. Silent circle. Movements matched. Fear grew slow. Then I ran. I locked the door. Nightmares followed. Eyes with wrong colors, like they were turned inside out. I do not know what guided them. It was not natural. The hollows breathe it. Distant neighbors leave you alone. No signal to cry for help. The pack tests. It found me. Telling this eases it a little, but it stays. Avoid streams in winter. The eyes wait. That handful of peanuts, just a simple snack. It became a signal. The crunch echoed. They copied it. Jaws snapping. Cold fur brushing. No bite. Only watching. Knowing. Years later, I still think about it. Was it me? The anger? The grief? Or was it always there? It does not matter. I still lose sleep. The wood stove warms the room, but the cold goes deeper. I was marked by the pack. That is my warning. Take it. Story 18. I sit here by the wood stove with the flames flickering low, and my mind just wanders right back to that hike in late 2020. That was a rough year for everyone, what with the sickness going around and folks hunkered down in their homes. I was working at the warehouse back then, stacking boxes day in and day out just to make ends meet. I lived in a little cabin up the hollow, right where the creek bends sharp before heading down toward the river. My nearest neighbor was Old Zeke, about 6 miles away on a gravel road that floods every spring. There's no cell service out there. The signal just dies the moment you pass the county line. It's just you and the trees crowding in, their silence feeling heavy like a wet blanket, muffling everything until you feel completely cut off from the rest of the world. That shift had been a drag, same as it always was. I was stacking those off-brand detergent boxes, the kind with the cheap blue labels that always peel at the corners. The warehouse was a massive metal barn, and every time a forklift beeped, the echo would bounce off the high ceilings and rattle your teeth. I'd grab a pallet, maybe 20 boxes high, and haul them to the shelves with a hand truck that squeaked on one wheel. The smell of that detergent clung to everything. It was a sharp, fake clean scent, like chemicals trying too hard to smell like a meadow. By lunch, my hands reeked of it. A soapy residue stayed on my skin even after I scrubbed them in the break room sink with that gritty pink soap. Blisters formed where the cardboard rubbed my hands, and those little red spots would turn raw and painful. When I'd unwrap my sandwich, the bread tasted faintly of detergent, mixing with the ham. The afternoon dragged on, the clock on the wall ticking slowly while the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like a swarm of angry hornets. My sweat mixed with that scent, making my shirt stiff and uncomfortable. By the end of the shift, I'd punch out with my hands still tingling from the lifting, smelling like a laundromat explosion. I'd drive home in my old pickup with the windows down to air things out, but the odor lingered, soaking right into the steering wheel. It was a simple job, but it wore you down box by box until your back ached and your nose burned. I kept at it because bills don't pay themselves. That smell, it grounded you in the mundane parts of life. It reminded you that life was just stacking and smelling, day after day. Anyway, after I clocked out that evening, I couldn't shake this feeling of restlessness. My cabin felt stuffy, even with the door propped open. I figured a hike would do me some good, let me stretch my legs and breathe something other than warehouse air. I grabbed my flashlight and a water bottle and headed into the overgrown thickets behind my property. The path wasn't marked. It was just a game trail cutting through the briars and the laurel bushes. It was late fall, so the leaves were mostly on the ground, crunching loudly under my boots. Darkness settled in quickly, the trees swallowing up the last of the light. There wasn't a breath of wind stirring, just that oppressive quiet pressing in on me. I pushed on for about an hour. The thickets got denser, snagging on my jeans. My hands still smelled like soap, and rubbing them on my coat didn't help one bit. I reckon I was deeper in the woods than usual, following the murmur of the creek until even that faded away. That's when I stumbled into the clearing. It was an open space, maybe 30 yards across. The trees ringed the area, but they looked all wrong. Their branches were bent into bizarre shapes, like runes or figures, twisting in ways that weren't natural. It looked as if they had grown that way on purpose. There were no leaves on the ground here. It was just barren, hard-packed dirt. The trees creaked softly. There wasn't any breeze, but they groaned faintly anyway. I froze. The patterns on the bark seemed to shift whenever I blinked. One limb was curled exactly like a human arm reaching out. I reached out and touched one of the trees. The bark was rough, but it was warm to the touch. It was pulsing faintly, like a heartbeat beneath my fingers. I jerked my hand back. A slow dread began to creep over me. The shapes of the trees started to resemble people. One curve looked just like my late father's hunch. I questioned my own head. Was it the warehouse fumes? But that pulse, it felt too real. The trees seemed to lean closer to me, and their groaning grew louder. I backed out of there gradually, not taking my eyes off them. The moment I hit the thickets, I turned and ran. The woods started to look normal again, and I made it home panting for breath. If I'm being honest, I thought it was just fatigue at first. A long shift and soapy, aching hands can play tricks on a man. But that place, the land itself, had changed into something wrong. In the nights following, I stayed inside. I kept the wood stove going, but a chill lingered deep in my bones. I told no one. Zeke was too far away, and I had no signal to call anyone. I don't know how to explain the wrongness of it. The trees were alive, but not in the way trees should be. They were warped sentinels. The silence of my cabin seemed to mock me. I reckon the hollows just twist sometimes, and a clearing like that marks you. I'm still awake thinking about it. That hike looped in my dreams for months. My days at the warehouse blurred together, stacking, smelling, aching. At home, I'd scrub my hands raw, but the soap clung to me like a reminder. I only ventured out for necessities, sticking strictly to the road. The trees along the drive seemed straighter, but I watched them warily. Having no cell service meant no quick help if that wrongness hit again. Zeke might hear a shotgun blast on a still night, but that was it. The isolation chewed at me and made every creak in the floorboards suspect. The path had pulled me in that night. After a supper of canned beans, I had paced the floor. My hands itched from the detergent, and my nails were caked with blue dust. I went out the door with my flashlight cutting through the fog. The thickets clawed at me, but I pushed through. The creek gurgled on my left, and then everything went silent. The clearing appeared suddenly. There was no transition. I was just there. The trees encircled me, their branches knotted into forms. One looked like a face with hollow eyes. The creaking started low, and the patterns moved subtly. When I touched that bark and felt the warmth throbbing like a vein under skin, my sanity started to fray. The ground was barren, just dirt staring back at me. As the trees groaned in protest, I backed away into the briars and ran until I was home with the door bolted. But the memory stays. I ramble about it because it eases the weight slightly. 2020 messed with everybody's head, I know. The warehouse was monotonous and the boxes were endless. I went out to escape, but I found something twisted. It was pulsing and warm, and it resembled my own kin. It closed in on me, and I fled. It changed me. Did I move away later? No, I'm still stuck here in my hollow home. There's still no service, and Zeke is still distant. The trees seem to oppress the quiet. I avoid the thickets now. I sit by the stove, but I can still feel that pulse. It's wrong land. The soapy smell eventually faded, but the memory stays sharp. I see those branches like ruins and remember the heartbeat in the bark. I see those people shapes and I question myself. I quit the warehouse years ago, and my hands are clean now, but the dread is still dirty. I'm shaking just telling this. Heed my words. Be careful of clearings. They twist things. In the crisp fall of 2020, my shift dragged on and I went out restless. I hiked deep and found a clearing that was wrong. The trees were bent, they creaked, and they had a pulse. They looked like my kin. Dread rose in me. I backed away, and I ran. Things looked normal again, but it lingers. If I'm being honest, I haven't entered the woods the same way since. My cabin creaks and the stove warms me, but the silence is just waiting. Don't stumble in. The wrongness grows. The trail was overgrown and the briars were thick, but I pushed through anyway. My flashlight was dim because the batteries were low. That clearing was barren, the sentinels were warped, and the patterns shifted. If you blink, it's wrong. That warm bark and that faint heartbeat. It looked like my dad. It looked like others, too. The leaning and the groaning made me panic slowly, and then I bolted for home. I was safe, but I questioned everything. I don't know what grew them, but it wasn't natural. The hollows changed the land. Being alone with distant neighbors and no signal makes it worse. The trees test you. They found my kin in me. Telling the story helps a little, but I'm still awake. Avoid the overgrown places. Those pulses are waiting. Back at the warehouse, the stacking was endless and the detergent felt like a curse. I went for a hike to wash it off, but I found something worse. Those twisted sentinels marked me deep. I've spent years pondering if it was real, and that pulse tells me yes. I have no friends close by, so I bear this alone. The nights feel lean and the groans are faint. Isolation amplifies it all. There is no escape. The wood stove pops, but I still feel the chill. That twisted place stays with me. The boxes were heavy and the air was stale, and I just wanted to breathe. But the thickets welcomed the dark, and the path was lost. That clearing was a trap. The trees were wrong from the start, bent with a purpose. They creaked without wind and shifted when I blinked. I regret touching them. I regret that warm pulse and those personal shapes. My father's curve haunts me. I ran desperate, and while the woods looked straight again, they were changed. Listen to me. Don't hike alone. The hollows twist the land, and it stays with you. My cabin is still mine, and the stove is faithful, but my memory is unfaithful. It pulses in my dreams. The warm bark and the kin shapes make me wake up shivering. The wrongness roots deep. That's my story. Take it for what it is. Story 19. I reckon it has been over a decade now since that night back in 2013, but some memories just don't fade away. They burrow deeper into your mind, like roots pushing through rocky soil. I was younger then, still grinding away at a desk job in town, pushing papers for the county office. I lived out in the foggy bottoms of the hollow, a place where the mist hangs low almost every morning and the creek whispers constantly. My nearest neighbors were the Harlan boys, but they lived about 7 miles up a winding dirt road that turns into a muddy mess every time it rains. There is no cell service out there, never has been, and I doubt there ever will be. You just have a landline that crackles whenever a storm is brewing. Most of the time, it is just you against the quiet. The trees crowd the paths, and their silence is heavy, as if they are holding their breath and waiting for you to make a mistake. That job was a slow killer. I sat under those flickering fluorescent lights all day long, the kind that hum faintly and buzz when they get old. The office was nothing more than a cinder block box with ceiling tiles stained yellow from years of leaks. Those lights hung in long strips, casting a harsh white glow that washed out everything and made your skin look sickly. I would stare at the paperwork, my eyes straining as the flicker danced in the corners of my vision like shadows playing tricks on me. Headaches built up slowly. They started as a dull throb behind my temples and sharpened into a stabbing pain by lunchtime. The light tubes would whine with a high-pitched sound whenever the air conditioning kicked on, vibrating just enough to rattle the fixtures. Dust gathered on the covers, making the light uneven. Some spots were brighter than others. Changing them was a real chore. You had to climb the ladder and twist the old bulb free with a gritty snap, feeling the heat from hours of burning. The new ones would click in cold, but the flicker always returned quickly as the parts aged. I sat there hour after hour, that buzz drilling into my skull, mixing with the sound of clacking keyboards and the gurgling coffee machine. It made colors blur and words swim on the page. Aspirin couldn't touch that pain. It only dulled the edge. That light grounded you in boredom. It reminded you that work was about enduring, not living. At quitting time, I would rub my eyes and see the afterimage of the lights pulsing like a heartbeat. It was a simple fixture, but it wore you down, light by flickering light. After one of those headache days, I couldn't sit still at home. My wife had gone to bed early. She had been feeling poorly that fall. and the cabin felt too small and close. I slipped my scratched wedding ring into my pocket for safekeeping. It was loose from years of wear, the gold worn thin at the edges. I figured a solitary night walk would shake off the boredom and let the fog cool my head. I stepped out, and the screen door slapped shut behind me. I didn't need a flashlight at first because the mist glowed faintly under the stars. The path wound down to the creek and then into the bottoms, where the ground gets soft and spongy. I walked steadily, my boots sinking softly into the damp earth. The fog thickened, curling around the trees like smoke. The silence pressed in on me. No animals were stirring, and the only thing I could see was my own breath hanging in the air. Suddenly, I felt like I was being watched. It was like eyes were fixed on my back. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The mist was playing tricks on me, making shapes shift and look vague. I tried to shake the feeling off and kept walking. But then, dark thoughts began to intrude. Doubts started creeping in. Why did I stay at that dead-end job? My regrets grew louder and louder in my head. Then, a voice whispered. It wasn't my own voice. It started listing my failures, missed chances, and the harsh words I had said to my wife. I began to second-guess every step I took. The trail became a blur. My memories twisted. In my mind, my wife's face changed, her eyes becoming accusing. You failed me, her voice seemed to echo inside my brain. I fiddled with the ring in my pocket. The metal was cool and helped ground me, but the pressure in my head kept building. Something was urging me to go deeper, to walk off the trail. Go on, it pushed. My unease turned into a deep dread. Shapes flickered in the mist ahead of me, but the real horror was inside my own mind, eroding my will to turn back. I started reciting old prayers. I stumbled along, fighting the seeds of doubt being planted in my soul. If I'm being honest, I thought it was just the headache lingering at first, the echo of the fluorescent buzz in my brain. But that voice was foreign, planting doubts like weeds. In the nights after that, I stayed very close to the cabin. I kept the wood stove going, using the warmth to push back the chill. But my thoughts still wandered, and I kept questioning all my life choices. I told my wife bits and pieces of what happened. She just nodded, but I could see the worry in her eyes. I had no one else to tell. The Harlans lived too far away, and there was no signal to share my burden. I don't know how to explain the wrongness of it. It wasn't something on the outside. It was something inside your head, twisting the truth. The quiet of the cabin seemed to mock me then. The trees outside stood silent, as if they knew exactly what was happening. I reckon those foggy bottoms sow those seeds of doubt sometimes. They grow if you let them, and to be honest, they are still sprouting inside me. That walk started out so innocent. Supper was done, just some fried eggs on the stove, and I was pacing the porch. My head throbbed faintly, and I had my ring safe in my pocket. I went out into the fog, following a familiar path. The creek gurgled on my left, and then went quiet. The mist swallowed every sound. The feeling of being watched built up gradually until the hairs on my neck stood up. My thoughts turned dark. I felt my job was worthless and my life was wasted. The whisper in my head murmured in agreement. My regrets swelled. We lost a child years ago, and the whisper asked, "Was it your fault?" It said yes. My memory of my wife shifted. Her smile turned into a sneer in my mind. I fiddled with my ring desperately. I felt the scratches under my thumb, and they felt real and solid. But the pressure urged me off the path and deeper into the bottoms. Shapes loomed in the mist. Were they trees or just echoes of my own fear? My inside was eroding, and my will was fraying. I muttered prayers, old ones from church, the words stumbling out of my mouth. I stumbled forward until the fog finally began to thin. I reached home, shaking all over, but the seeds had been planted. I ramble about this because it loops endlessly in my mind. It was a damp fall in 2013. The job was monotonous, and the flickering lights caused me pain. I went home to escape, but the walk I took found something much worse. I felt watched, and then I felt intruded upon. My doubts were amplified. My memories of my kin were twisted. I was urged to go deep into the dark, and I had to fight it with prayer. My safety was a narrow thing. My thoughts were changed forever. My wife has passed away since then, but in my doubts, I still hear her voice accusing me. There is no service to call for help, and the Harlans are still distant. The trees oppress you with their muteness. I avoid the bottoms now. I sit by the stove, but the whispers are still faint in the background. My mind feels wrong. I still wear the ring. It's a scratched reminder. I fiddled with it that night as an anchor, but the voice still cut through. It recited my failures and made me question my steps. The horror was internal. Those seeds grow, and while prayers saved me and I stumbled to safety, the feeling lingers. Heed the fog, friend. It plants things in you. In 2013, my boredom had peaked. I was chained to that desk. My home was tense. I went for a night walk in the fog and felt watched. Thoughts intruded, and a foreign voice made my regrets loud. My memories morphed, and I felt my wife accusing me. The gold ring was my only ground. The pressure built to go off the trail, and shapes flickered in the dark. My will eroded, but I recited those prayers and stumbled out. If I'm being honest, I haven't fully shaken them off. The cabin creaks and the stove pops, but the silence is just waiting. Don't walk alone in the mist. Doubt is waiting for you there. The path was misty and my boots were heavy, but I pushed on anyway. The creak faded, the watched feeling prickled my skin, and the voice started low. It mocked my choices. My memories warped, and my wife's face looked wrong. I twisted the ring on my fingers as the urge to go deeper grew. The horror was in my mind. The prayers were old and forceful. The fog finally broke, and I bolted for home. But those thoughts grow. I don't know what sold them. It wasn't a physical thing. It was a mental wrongness. The bottoms breathe it into you. Being alone with distant kin and no signal makes it worse. Doubt finds the cracks in you. Telling the story eases the seed, but it sprouts again at night. Avoid being alone with your thoughts. The whispers will call to you. I eventually quit that desk job, but the headaches still echo. I can't blame the lights. The walk was the true cause. My thoughts were intruded upon, my failures were amplified, and my love was twisted. I was urged to get lost. Prayers were my only shield. I fought for my safety, but the seeds were planted deep. I spend years pondering if it was real, and the seeds tell me yes. My wife is gone, and the voice I hear is hers. I bear this alone. The nights feel long, and the whispers are soft. Isolation feeds it. There is no escape. The wood stove warms me, but the doubt is cold. My mind is twisted. The files at work were stacked endless, and the lights felt like they were humming accusations. I went for a walk to find peace, but the bottom swallowed me. The voice joined me, the doubts receded, and the regrets bloomed. My memories were poisoned. I clutched that ring as the pressure pushed me off the trail. I stumbled clear, but I never truly harvested those seeds. Listen to me, don't let them grow. The bottoms plant things that stay in your thoughts. My cabin and stove are faithful, but my memory is not. There are whispers in the dark and doubt in my mind. It keeps me awake. The wrongness has roots. That's my story. Take it as a warning. Story 20. I haven't slept a full night through since that morning back in 2007. My eyes get heavy around midnight, but then the memories start to creep in, like fog rolling up from the creek, and I find myself wide awake, staring at the cracks in the ceiling. Back then, I was working the graveyard shift at the diner off the county road, washing dishes until my arms ached. I lived in a rundown cabin deep in the hollow, where the slopes climbed so steep that the trees seemed to choke out the sky. My nearest neighbor was the widow Crane, who lived about 8 miles away over the ridge. and you could only reach her if the bridge wasn't washed out by the rain. I had no self. Not even a leaf would rustle unless a storm was brewing. That kind of quiet gets inside you. It makes every little sound echo the wrong way. Working an all-nighter was always a slog. Piles of plates would be stacked high, covered in grease from burgers and fries. But the worst part was that greasy sponge. Lord, that thing never dried right. It was one of those cheap yellow ones bought in bulk, and it stayed sopping wet no matter how hard you wrung it out. I'd dunk it in the soapy water and feel the slime build up between my fingers, that slick, oily residue that comes from hours of scrubbing. The sponge smelled rank, like old dishwater mixed with rotting food, and that scent would cling to your skin long after the shift was over. It pruned my fingers every night, turning them wrinkled and white until they were sensitive to the touch. I'd squeeze that sponge hard over the sink, watching the gray suds drip out slowly, but it always stayed damp, breeding a musty odor that filled the back room. The edges were frayed from use, and little fibers would shed into the water, floating like lint. After midnight, once the last customer left, I'd attack the remaining stack of dishes. The sponge would scrape against the porcelain with a wet, rasping sound as the suds bubbled up. The faucet handle leaked steadily, adding to the puddle under my feet. That sponge saw me through years of work, even when I patched it with tape after it tore. The grease never fully came out. It just layered on, making the sponge heavier each time. It was a simple tool, but it grounded me in the grime. It reminded me that work was just an endless cycle of suds and pruned skin. By dawn, my hands would throb, reeking of dishwater. My shift ended around 5 in the morning, before the sun was up. I couldn't go straight home because I was too wired from the coffee and the constant hum of the fluorescent lights. I figured a pre-dawn hike up the steep slopes would burn off that energy so I could sleep properly. I grabbed my coat and drove my old Chevy to the trailhead at the base of the hill. I parked in the gravel pull-off, and there wasn't another soul around. I stepped out into the chill, my boots hitting the damp earth. The path climbed sharply, with roots snaking across the ground like traps. It was thick with darkness, but I knew the way by feel. The trees loomed close, their silence pressing down on me, and not a single bird had started to sing yet. As I hiked, the light began to creep in gradually. A gray dawn started filtering through the treetops. That's when I spotted the tracks. At first, they were human boot prints. They were pressed deep into the mud, looking like work boots very similar to my own. My heart skipped a beat. No one hikes this early out here. I followed them out of curiosity, but then, right in the middle of a stride, the prints changed. They morphed into animal paws, huge, like a bear's, with claws that gouged deep into the dirt. Then, they changed back into boots. The tracks began to circle my own path. There was no fresh mud stirred up, but the prints looked recent, their edges still sharp. I froze. The air grew heavy, like it does right before a thunderclap. Then I heard a sound in the distance, a shuffling noise, like something heavy was being dragged through the leaves. A slow dread began to build. I don't know how to explain it, but it felt like something had been pacing me all night long. I kept going, though I know now it was a foolish thing to do. The tracks led off the main path and into the thicker brush. There I found scraps of things, torn fabric, maybe from a shirt, arranged in a neat pile. There were bone shards mixed in, white and splintered. It looked deliberate, as if someone, or something, had left them there to be found. A musk hit my nose. It was a thick, animal reek. The tracks pointed directly toward a burrow ahead of me. The entrance was wide, just enough for a man to crawl inside. I didn't stay to look. I turned and backtracked as fast as I could. That's when I saw new prints appear behind me. They were mirroring my own steps, but they were wrong. They had claws where the toes should be. I ran. As the sun rose higher, it seemed to gradually erase the prints from the drying mud. I reached my truck, shaking all over. If I'm being honest, I tried to tell myself it was just a lack of sleep. I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me after staring at the dynolights all night. But those scraps of fabric, they were real enough to touch. In the days that followed, I avoided those slopes. I stayed in my cabin with the wood stove burning high to keep out the chill. But the memory drags behind me, just like that shuffling sound I heard in the woods. I told no one. Widow Crane lived too far away, and there was no way to call for help. The isolation chewed at me, and the trees outside just stood there, mute and judging. I reckon the hollows leave evidence like that just to taunt you. It proves that what you saw was real. I still hear that dragging sound in my dreams. That hike haunts me in pieces. The shift at the diner blurred into the walk. My hands were still pruned, and the slime from the sponge felt fresh on my skin. Home felt far away, but I pushed up that slope anyway. When the tracks caught my eye near a bend, the boot heels were dug in deep, as if someone heavy had been standing there. Then they morphed suddenly into broad paws, overlapping in ways that made no sense. They circled back, crossing my own steps. Even though there was no wind, I could hear the leaves rustling faintly nearby. My curiosity had pulled me toward those red-checked flannel scraps and the small rabbit bones arranged in a circle. The air had thickened, and that musk was so sharp it burned my throat. When I saw the dark hole of the burrow with its fresh dug earth, and heard the shuffling getting closer, my dread finally peaked. I turned back and saw those fresh, twisted prints behind me. I bolted down the path, and the sun eventually wiped them away. I reached the sanctuary of my truck, but the taunt remains. I ramble about this because it won't settle in my mind. The winter of 2007 was a cold one. The shifts at the diner were endless, and that sponge was eternally damp. I went out at dawn and found something that shouldn't exist. My wife is gone now, but back then, she saw how I shook when I got home. There was no cell service to explain it, and Crane was too distant to hear me. The trees are silent judges. I avoid the woods at pre-dawn now. I sit by my stove, but I still hear that dragging sound. I eventually burned that sponge, but the pruned skin left faint scars on my mind, just like those tracks. They are invisible now, but the taunt goes deep. Be careful on those slopes. They leave things behind to let you know they're watching. In 2007, my shift was done and the dishes were piled high. I skipped going home and hiked the steep hill. Dawn crept in, and I spotted the tracks that changed from boots to paws. They circled my path. I found the torn fabric and the bone shards. The musk was heavy, the burrow was wide, and something was dragging through the leaves. When I saw the new mirrored prints behind me, I ran until the sun rose. Those hollows leave evidence. They find your path and they pace you. Now, I stay awake and listen to the shuffle in the dark. The Rangdas is still out there, pacing. That is my tale. Heed it.